Hello there, I'm Lloyd Evans and you're watching the John Cedars channel from The Bunker, and you join me for the second part of a live stream trilogy in which, with the help of some special guests, I am delving deep into the pages of the latest version of the secretive Elders Manual, Shepherd the Flock of God, which ordinary Jehovah's Witnesses are not allowed to read. With me for part two of this series of discussions is my good friend and colleague Mark O'Donnell, who occasionally answers to the name John Redwood. Mark, it's always a pleasure to have you on the channel.
Thanks, Lloyd. It's a little lonely here, just the two of us. I'm a little worried about that. I already talk enough as it is. I don't know if people want to hear even more from me.
But you're so good at talking, Mark. We thought we should have a special episode where we just let you do that. But what better subject to unleash you on than this chapter, this horrendous chapter? It is what we've already established is a horrendous book,
sadly,
on child abuse. So we were just talking off camera. First of all, let me answer a question from a viewer who actually contacted JW Survey with a question. They wanted to know if we could establish for that the Shepherd book is out of bounds for Jehovah's Witnesses. So let's immediately jump to the Shepherd book, because this is actually dealt with in one of the earliest pages. Let me just find the page number for you. And we were just talking off camera that there was an earlier letter for the predecessor to this book, the KS10, or the 2010 Shepherd book, which made clear that elders' wives weren't to bind the book for their husbands in case they saw some of it. But this is the introduction to the Shepherd book, and you can see there in point 3, this publication is copyrighted and confidential. It is issued to each appointed elder. If an elder is deleted for reasons other than moving to another congregation with a favorable recommendation, he should turn over this publication to the Congregation Service Committee to be destroyed, and any electronic copies in his possession should be deleted. This is a book, as a cat walks past Mark, that you are not allowed to have in your possession unless you're an elder. And I believe I even had on the channel, I think it was in part 2 of the Bethelites Tell All, a Bethelite who goes by the name Camden Pine related an experience of being instructed to, how can I put this? He had to mail a Shepherd book from Bethel, and a lady worked in the mailing department and offered to do it for him, and he refused because they'd been instructed that sisters weren't to handle this book. So that's how seriously they take this. You're not allowed to handle this book unless you're an elder, according to Watchtower.
No, it's a great point, Lloyd, that the average rank and file publisher, male or female, can't see the book, especially women. And the reality is, I think that, there probably are some who might pick up a copy off of their husband's shelf if he puts it on a shelf, or maybe even sees it in his briefcase or sees some open papers. It's a real culture of secrecy. And what I find interesting is that the religion is supposed to be entirely based upon the Bible and Bible principles. And everything in the Bible that the Jehovah's Witnesses use is open to the public, open to everyone, including children. And yet we have so many documents, not just this Elders Manual, but we have the branch organization manual and hundreds of other manuals and letters that not even congregation elders will ever see. And so I think it's a valid point that we have a culture where even the congregation elders themselves don't have the full picture of child abuse, because they're looking through a very tightly focused lens, which is their own congregation or two congregations if they've been part of more than one. And they have very little experience with what goes on at Watchtower headquarters or with other bodies of elders. And so they're kept in the dark almost as much as rank and file publishers and the women in the congregation.
Well, would it be fair to say, Mark, that there are, in effect, two versions of the child abuse policy? There's the version that we're about to read, which is what elders use, and there's the May 29 Watchtower, which basically spins everything based on the knowledge that witnesses don't have access to this information themselves.
And that's the case with other Watchtower policies as well, such as the shunning policy. You have what's put into print, and then you have what actually happens within the organization. So we know that the Watchtower organization, Jehovah's Witnesses, say that when a person is disfellowshipped, normal family relations continue. We see that all the time. This is going on in Norway right now in the press. And there goes a cat. So
we've gone from dogs. We've gone from Cliff being overrun with dogs to you being overrun with cats. So goodness knows what animal's going to feature in part 3, but there we go.
Yeah, and I'm not really sure if cats are fall under the ban on the Shepherd the Flock book in both of its versions. But yeah, it's true that the policies vary depending on what Watchtower wants the public to know. And this is also true in child custody cases, in which what is reality that is presented in those child custody in cases involving a Jehovah's Witness parent and a non-Jehovah's Witness parent. They misrepresent what actually goes on within the lives of children, and they try to present the child as having a normal family upbringing without any problems with disfellowshipping or shunning. There's no problems with being allowed to participate in sports or in music. They have a healthy environment and lifestyle. But the reality is, we all know, growing up as Jehovah's Witnesses, that children have very much a cloistered existence and are not permitted to play organized sports, except in rare occasions. It's, where someone would deviate from those rules. So, clearly there's a difference between what's published, what they want the public to know, and what actually takes place.
So just kind of going back to this particular material that we're going to be discussing, I thought it might be helpful to let the viewers know a little bit of the history of this subject as regards the Shepherd book. Of course, the precursor to the Shepherd book was the book Pay Attention to Yourselves and All the Flock. And fascinating to see, Mark, that in this book, you can just about find child abuse in the index, and it's literally limited to a couple of references. One being on page 93, where it says victims of such sexual abuse need to be treated with extreme thoughtfulness and kindness. Elders should always do what they reasonably can to protect children from further abuse. Follow the society's directives on such matters. So kind of moves things onto the organization. But that's more or less, apart from another brief mention, that's everything that this book has to say on child sex abuse. Then in the 2010 replacement, the original Shepherd the Flock of God, you had a section in one of the chapters amounting to, I think, 3 or 4 paragraphs. Here, you've got a copy there as well, I see. Which was
not my copy.
Little bit more, a little bit more comprehensive, but most of the material was still scattered throughout the book in odd places. The understanding being, Mark, that if you had this book and a problem came up regarding child sex abuse, you would go to the Society's most recent letter on the subject.
Correct. Yes.
And now you have, in the 2019 version, they've decided to create a whole chapter on child abuse, which is chapter 14, which again more or less sums up Watchtower's position on child abuse.
It's almost as thick as a Bible, isn't it, Lloyd? You look at this book, at this organizational policy and letters. I think it's replaced the Bible.
Well,
it really is.
Well, we were commenting, Cliff and I, in the first part, that there were certain chapters that were devoid of any scriptural references. So yeah, it's definitely not. You can't call it biblical. So let's jump straight into. Let's see here. Let's jump into this book. I need to get my head around these controls. Okay. It's just a little bit sluggish. Do bear with me.
Yeah, so while you're looking for that, I think you've just got it up on screen now. But as you mentioned, they've got the newly adjusted Shepherd the Flock book from 2010 now incorporated into this new manual, the Shepherd the Flock, with all of the policy letters. And their intent is to update approximately every 6 months. So this came out in January, and I believe it was around September, August, September, correct me if I'm wrong, they've just updated and produced the latest copy with some of the revisions. And the revisions were actually enumerated in the S-147 form, which is the monthly announcements, which, by the way, only elders can see the announcements to elders. I do
actually have that form. You kindly shared it with me, Mark. And
yes.
What's interesting is that not everything is mentioned on here. Because right. I was transferring, I have my own handwritten notes in my copy, and when I was transferring them, which was a pain to do, from one to the other, I couldn't help but notice that the layout was different on certain pages, and it's because there were changes, and they weren't necessarily changes that were listed in the on the sheet. But I will say this, that the changes on the sheet, I have yet to find anything that's too outrageous or scandalous. Would that be fair?
Yeah, that's correct. So they have not altered their position in the last 9 months with regards to their child abuse policy. There was some very, very minor change that was mentioned in the S-147. And but as far as the two witness rule, the child abuse policy, they've essentially doubled down on everything and have not changed that policy. And they continue to advise elders they must contact the legal department first and not report any matters to the police unless, in very rare exceptions, the legal department determines that there is no clergy penitent confidentiality involved. And in those rare cases, they would advise an elder that they are free to report to the authorities, or even tell them to report to the authorities. But perhaps we'll get into this a little bit later. There have been a few odd cases where they have advised elders to report to the authorities, and normally that would occur after a parent has already reported to the authorities. A couple of factors happen. One, they wait until a parent actually comes forward and reports, and then they attempt to fulfill their reporting obligation after it's been reported, but not before. So that would be the primary case. The second would be when there is an example of clergy penitent exception that does not apply. And that's very rare. I mean, almost all states have mandated reporting law, and then they also have some language that needs to change, but it has language that says there is an exception for clergy or priest who receive some form of communication, and it's the practice of their religious beliefs to not share that with anyone, including the authorities. So we'll get into that a little bit further.
We will. So let's, without further ado, jump into, I'm going to call it the introductory paragraphs, because this chapter is divided into sections, but there are 3 paragraphs at the beginning before the sections begin. And what's interesting is if we jump to paragraph 1, it says elders should adhere closely to the direction in this chapter when a matter involving child abuse comes to their attention. Doing so will uphold the sanctity of Jehovah's name. Interesting that that's first. And contribute toward the safety of minors. Do you think that this material contributes to the safety of minors, Mark?
No, I really don't, because the bottom line is that you were asking that clergy, or anyone who's a mandated reporter report allegations of abuse to the authorities, and to allow victims to have the opportunity to be interviewed by trained professionals, including law enforcement as well as professional therapists. So it is not only dangerous to the victims themselves, but it's dangerous to future victims or people that are not protected, including non-Jehovah's Witness children who are not protected because of Watchtower's policies. And the reality of the matter is they simply don't care about non-Jehovah's Witness children. In fact, their representative, Thomas Jefferson Jr., who is a branch member who testified at the Fessler trial in 2017, was questioned on the witness stand as to whether or not elders have an obligation to protect non-witness children. And he answered it very directly and said, no, there is no obligation. It was shocking.
Well, we also have here Watchtower's definition of what child sexual abuse is. It seems fairly reasonable, apart from when I was reading it, it didn't seem to have any mention of grooming behavior, which of course is usually the mechanism whereby predators will gain abuse victims to begin with. They will go through this grooming process, and there didn't seem to be anything highlighting that sort of behavior in this paragraph. Am I wide of the mark here?
I think that's very accurate to say that, because that is the fact. And one of the things you notice from reading Watchtower publications is that they do not have any professionals or professional writers who are therapists, doctors, or otherwise who actually write for Watchtower. This is all material that's produced by the writing department, and those are anonymous men, and we know that they're not professionals. We know that they don't use their own names, and they can't cite any of their own sources for information about the protection of children, because they simply don't want to be. They don't want any accountability. They don't want to be named. So yes, these are people who are producing material that the witnesses are accepting lock, stock, and barrel in full trust in the clergy, full trust in the elders, without realizing they're trusting in unqualified individuals. And so back to grooming. Yeah, the grooming process is something it's very complicated. It's something that really only therapists and profilers can fully understand that process. And this came up in the Arkansas case with the decades-long grooming of all of these victims, starting in New York, moving over to Indiana, and then ultimately over a 17-year period in Arkansas. This man showed up in Arkansas in the year 2000 before some of his victims were even born. And he groomed them because he knew full well how to groom them, because he had done it in Indiana with multiple victims. And we don't even know how many at this point. There's so many. And it all started, much earlier in his life. And it even happened while he was a Brooklyn Bethel member. So yeah, I agree, Lloyd, that the grooming behavior is very serious. It's something we need to give attention to, and Watchtower doesn't give any attention to that.
Moving on to paragraph 4 in these introductory paragraphs, you have this cookie cutter language that we're so used to now. It's just sickening when you hear it. First of all, it says, from the Bible standpoint, child sex abuse is a gross sin. Well, this is the whole problem with the policy, the fact that it's a sin first and a crime only by coincidence, according to Watchtower. And then you have this Jehovah's Witnesses abhor child sexual abuse. Of course you do. Well, actually, no one's disputing the fact that theologically you do abhor child abuse. It's just that you wouldn't know that when you examine some of the policies that actually facilitate it.
There's no question, Lloyd, and it really is just an empty statement to say Jehovah's Witnesses abhor child abuse. We know that all those people in Arkansas that were members of the congregation whose children were abused over a 17-year period, or some portion of that period, Of course they abhor child abuse. The children abhor it. The parents abhor it. Of course they do. This is not, that's a deflection. That is a deflection from the real issue, which is how to handle allegations of child sexual abuse, what to do with them, how to let the professionals handle it, and even how to handle it internally. So all of that is where the corruption, the cover-up, and the problem exists, much like it did within the Catholic Church.
Indeed. If we just move on to the next part of that same paragraph. Again, my computer isn't cooperating. I'm
so
just
you're
going to
on
read it.
number 4 or 5?
Yeah. So it says, thus the congregation will not shield any perpetrator of such repugnant acts from the consequences of his sin. I think anyone who's familiar, Mark, with the JW versus Watchtower case and the fact that Watchtower unsuccessfully petitioned the Supreme Court of the United States of America for its right as a religion to literally shield perpetrators of this abomination by keeping secret records that aren't available to the authorities. Anyone who knows about that can only view this as an extremely disingenuous thing to say.
Exactly. If anyone wants to read about this from a non-apostate source, all they have to do is go to Amazon and for a few dollars pick up The Humanity of Justice by Burke Strunsky. He spends an entire chapter discussing the criminal case of JW versus Watchtower, which of course at that time it was Gilbert Simmental. So it was the criminal case of Gilbert Simmental. And the entire case was built around the fact that the Jehovah's Witness elders did not, they refused initially to comply with the request or the demand that they reveal the confession of Gilbert Simmental to law enforcement and ultimately to testify in court. And the only way that they ended up prosecuting and sending this man to prison was on a technicality where they proved that Watchtower was basically spreading this information or would spread the information not only to the Judicial Committee that ultimately later disfellowshipped Simmental, but they would give that information to an appeals committee or to the circuit overseer. And in other words, what I'm saying is that they broke privilege by their own policy. And it was the prosecutor, Burke Strunsky, who just toiled over this for a very long period of time until he could prove that Watchtower broke privilege and therefore lost the right to claim privilege. This was not a Gilbert Simmental went to a priest or an elder and confessed, and therefore that was kept private. This was a whole bunch of elders, whole bunch of other people, society's service department. They all knew about it. And so there was no privilege. They were forced to testify in court. And that's what sent the man to prison.
Didn't Strunsky actually quote from the Shepherd book in demonstrating that there's no privilege?
Yeah. So anybody that wants to pick up a copy and read that, it's I think it's chapter.
I'm only asking because one thing that was obvious from when I was preparing, not just for this video but for the previous video, was how frequently you come across passages that completely obliterate the idea of clergy penitent privilege, saying, oh, share the information with this person, share the information, make sure the whole body is aware of at least the basic issue and blah, blah, blah. So throughout the book, there's very damning stuff if you want to try and suggest that clergy penitent privilege applies.
Yeah, you're right. So he did refer to Watchtower's own book, their own writings, in order to incriminate them and show that they broke privilege. Yes.
But just in this highlighted text, I just want to move on to the next sentence. It says, the congregation's handling of an accusation of child sexual abuse is not intended to replace the secular authorities' handling of the matter. Well, it's all very well saying it's not intended, but it frequently does replace when evidence of criminal nature is withheld from the authorities.
That's clear. It absolutely replaces the secular authorities' handling because they, in fact, obstruct justice. And as we just discussed in the Simmental case, and this is true of many others, they obstruct the handling of child abuse investigations in multiple ways. And one of the ways is by obviously not reporting it, not cooperating with the investigation, and then ultimately, in the case of those victims who have been interviewed by the elders on multiple occasions, we might discuss this a little bit more later, but this actually is extremely damaging to victims who, according to the professionals, the victims need to be interviewed as few times as possible, both in an investigative setting and also in a therapy setting. So, I mean, it takes years and years and years for these police detectives, investigators, and therapists to understand how to interview or not interview a victim of abuse. And everything that the organization does with reference to child abuse victims is improper. It breaks all of those laws, and it makes the work of the investigators and therapists far more difficult.
Do you think there's anything deliberate in the wording here? Because they could have written, the congregation's handling of an accusation of child sex abuse does not replace the secular authorities' handling of the matter. Instead, they've chosen is not intended to replace, almost like an acknowledgement, but an acknowledgement to themselves and not to the elders reading it, because they're kind of, again, almost banking on the fact that most elders who read this won't know the full picture.
You know, this whole book and this whole chapter is filled with what I call clever wording or misleading wording. I'm not sure if we got to the part where it says individuals who learn of an allegation of child abuse may be obligated to report the allegation to secular authorities.
Yeah.
But it's very clever that they use the word individuals instead of members of clergy or elders who learn of allegations may be obligated. So already it puts it in their minds that we're not saying that elders may be obligated to report to the secular authorities. They don't want that language out there. But the fact is, that's the law, that clergy, police, educators, medical professionals are obligated to report or bring this to the attention of authorities. And so Watchtower chooses to use the term individuals may be obligated to report allegations. It's very confusing, and I don't defend the elders in any way, but this shows how the problem goes right to the top. It is the wording and direction of Watchtower that is causing this entire issue.
Indeed. And if we just move on to the second part of that paragraph, it says, therefore, the victim, her parents, or anyone else who reports such an allegation to the elders should be clearly informed that they have the right to report the matter to the secular authorities. Elders do not criticize anyone who chooses to make such a report. And Mark, I'm just reading from my notes that I had to transfer.
Right.
It always reminds me when it says you have the right, and then I juxtapose it against what Stephen Lett said in a talk at the convention, where he said, just because you have the right to do something doesn't mean you should do that thing. All things are lawful. Not all things are advantageous. So just because you're entitled to do something doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. That's the kind of element of witness culture that this policy completely overlooks. And also there's a difference between not dissuading and actively encouraging. So if elders are really taking seriously the need to protect their congregation from further victims being accrued or accumulated, they should be encouraging or telling the victim or the family to go to the police, not merely saying, well, it's your decision.
Yeah, I've written about that term absolute right a number of times, including in several JW survey articles. That is a term that came up in Australia. It came up in multiple other civil cases here in the United States, where they use this clever language of absolute right to say that, look, we're not preventing parents from going to the police. They have the absolute right. But that in no way says they are advised. Nowhere in this book, nowhere in any Watchtower article, including the one that we've discussed from May of this year, nowhere does it ever say that elders should, or parents should, immediately contact law enforcement when their child is abused, or when their child says they're abused, or some other form of the allegation. And that is the point. They won't say that.
Takes us to the final introductory paragraph, because it says the scriptures place the responsibility on parents for teaching and protecting their children. Basically, it's all on the parents. And this was also a thought that was expressed even more tersely in the May 2019 Watchtower. Watchtower effectively washing its hands of the responsibility here. And then at the end of the paragraph 5, it says, our publications and website contain much helpful information to assist parents. And I've put in my notes, ... that nowhere tells them to report to police.
Exactly my point. In nowhere do you find an admonition to contact law enforcement. So this is what we call an omission. And omissions like this, growing up as a Jehovah's Witness, when you have something of that importance that is omitted, that in itself is a clear signal to anyone who's a witness that, whoa, hang on, I shouldn't do it, because the Watchtower didn't advocate for it. So you could apply that to just about anything, perhaps education. Nowhere does the Watchtower organization say, what they say, we value education, but in nowhere does it say we recommend that you achieve a higher learning, or go out and to help others, become a doctor, or in nowhere do they encourage a person to achieve any sort of goals like that are not directly related to what they call spiritual goals. So by the omission, that in itself is a statement, and that applies to these child abuse concerns, where if Watchtower doesn't say it, then they're not going to do it.
Cesar Velasquez says, if it's all on the parents, why involve the elders to begin with? Good point.
Yeah, because it's the law.
And by the way, Mark, what we did with Cliff was just go through, because we need to pace ourselves, I think, with this nonsense, or we'll go crazy.
We'll be here all night.
Some would say I'm already crazy, but let's at least take a break when we get to the end of a section and take a few of the comments. So I'm just scrolling through. So 720 Red Dog says, yes, you can report it to police, but you're likely to be disfellowshipped for not following the elders. Actually, that's not necessarily true. They have actually put in wording in this Shepherd book, in fact, to say that it doesn't amount to slander if you approach the authorities. But this wording regarding slander was absent in the Pay Attention book, which is, I think, why there are so many cases, Mark, of abuse victims facing judicial action just for going to the authorities, which I think is what 720 Red Dog is referring to.
And we do know that a person is going to lose their privilege as a ministerial servant or an elder if they fail to follow Watchtower's direction. We have direct proof of that in the Irish elders case and in many other cases where men were removed from their positions for speaking to the authorities about child abuse.
Indeed. Jules Petit says they throw elders under the bus every time. It is fascinating how you do see this, and Mark, you've been in a few cases where they've essentially said, well, what does this have to do with the Christian Congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses? This is why are we being tried for what a few elders have done? And here you have an entire chapter telling elders what to do, and yet they still try and wash their hands of it.
Yeah, I had a case very recently where an elder, an active elder who was the coordinator of the body of elders, reached out to me, and he was in despair because he had, and I can't give away any details because it's under investigation. It's a very serious case, but I can say that this elder had been told last December not to contact the authorities. And a few months later, when he contacted Watchtower's legal and service department a second time, he said to them, well, you told me not to report to the authorities, because by this time a parent had actually spoken to the authorities. And then Watchtower said, well, now it's okay to speak to the authorities. And he said, well, why didn't you tell me that back in December when you told me, and I have a witness here on the phone with me that was there, you told me not to report this to the authorities at all. And they said, destroy the notes from that conversation. And this upset him greatly to the point where he ultimately reached out to us. And I'm not going to get into any more of the details of the case, but exactly that these elders are being thrown under the bus. They're being shifted around, kicked around, told what to do, told what not to do. And worst of all, they're just given these mixed signals, and they don't understand how big the problem is in other states, because they're, as I mentioned before, they're dealing with, the lens of their local congregation and what this book says that we're talking about today. They look at the book, they call Watchtower. Watchtower knows everything. Watchtower has the database. They've known this for years. And yet these elders, some of them are newly appointed. They're dealing with child abuse cases they shouldn't be dealing with. And there you go. They have very little knowledge of this, and they're being shuffled around by the organization's policies. And some of them, I do feel bad that they're going through this.
I think it would be safe to say that if you are an elder watching this, if it's not already obvious that you're in entirely the wrong position and you ought to get out of it as rapidly as you can, hopefully it will be obvious by the end of our conversation. Lou Knight says, keep in mind, this is a rule book for company men. The governing body knows that they can, for the most part, say whatever they want and make up whatever random rules they want, and the elders reading will obey. That's certainly the case. So, yeah, a number of comments coming through, and unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to read all of them, but we will periodically be giving ourselves a break, and I will try to read a few comments. Here's one in German that looks like it's actually a super chat. Now, I must also thank people who are able to do super chats, because, as I said in the last one, this video will be demonetized. So it's very helpful to support the channel if you're able to, but I certainly don't expect it. So this viewer, so geht das nu auch wieder nicht, says, from so get das nu auch wieder nicht, Lloyd, great job. Regards to you girls. I hope I've not said anything profane or obscene. It sounds fairly innocent. So
I couldn't tell you.
So let's just remove that, and I'll try and go back to our screen with the book itself. There we go. And actually, let's put up another banner so that when I'm putting the when I'm compiling my timestamps, because if you're watching this after the fact, you will have timestamps so that you can jump to the relevant section if you want to. We're now going to be discussing legal considerations. So paragraph 6 says, and it's taken 6 paragraphs to say this, apparently, child abuse is a crime. In some jurisdictions, individuals who learn of an allegation of child abuse, actually, Mark, you know what? The whole chapter, if you think about it, could just be those 5 words. Child abuse is a crime. If you actually take those words
Correct.
seriously, you don't actually need a chapter at all, do you?
Look, let's just call it child abuse is a crime. What do we do with crimes? We let law enforcement handle that. End of story. Chapter, rip it out, leave those words in. We're done. And how would that harm the religion, Lloyd? I mean, come on. How would that? They can believe in paradise earth, the resurrection. They can talk about paradise. They can present their carts. Look, this is a crime. And even though they cleverly now admit that it's a crime, they're not treating it like a real crime. So I agree completely. Let's just let the law enforcement handle it. They're only damaging their own organization and the people who donate to it. I mean, we just discussed the JW versus Watchtower case. That's one case where they've now got to pay close to $6 million, a $4 million judgment plus accrued interest to just one victim in that case. And that's almost $6 million of donated money, ice cream money from children who are putting their dollars in the contribution box, supporting an organization that is not protecting them.
I'm going to read on with the paragraph, but I'm going to subtly alter the words. In some jurisdictions, individuals who learn of an allegation of murder may be obligated by law to report the allegation to the secular authorities. I mean, again, if it's a crime, why are you interested in what your responsibilities are on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis? If it's a crime, you report it, regardless of whether the law insists that you report it.
Yes. And that's because they treat the sexual sins very differently, and they believe that children are complicit or can be complicit, particularly baptized children who are very young. And I think we are going to talk about this in a short while, but they have, they have a button in their database or a checkbox where they check whether or not a child is complicit in their own sexual abuse. And that's the first thing they check for. They did this. Yeah, they did this in the Arkansas case, in which they actually eventually did call back to Indiana about a victim there. And one of the, they wanted to get hold of that person.
Sorry, when you say checkbox, Mark, because you were telling me, and I didn't even know this, we worked together very closely, and there's some things that you only let slip occasionally. And the other day we were talking about the database, and you just kind of casually said, "Oh yeah, I've seen part of it." And I was like, "What are you talking about?" And you said, "Yeah, when I went to the Montana case, because I was working with the lawyers, they showed me a printout from the database." And is that what you're talking about when you talk about the check mark?
So I'm not sure which lawyers you're referring to.
Oh, okay.
What I'm referring to has not been released in any way to the public and may never be for a very long time, because it involves multiple cases.
Yeah.
But what I can tell you is, because I work so closely with law enforcement and with civil attorneys in these cases, is that one of the things we are investigating, meaning that I'm contributing to the work that they are doing, is the fact that Watchtower has let it slip, partly because it's part of the discovery process. But in one case, they revealed a document that was a printout of their internal database. Watchtower is a very sophisticated, isolated, protected database of child molesters or child abusers, and not just alleged, but confirmed cases of child abuse. And included in that database is a database of victims. And I can't put this up on screen, but what I can do is I can pull it up.
Yeah.
I can't, but I can pull it up on my screen and just tell you what it says. One of the things included in their database is called a victim profile. Watchtower has a victim profile for all of the victims of any one given perpetrator. And of course, from Australia, we know that there could be 5, 10, 15 or more victims of any given alleged perpetrator or known perpetrator of child sexual abuse. So I'm looking at it right now, and at the very top of the database printout is victim profile, and right underneath of it, it says attorney-client privileged. And it has all sorts of check boxes, all sorts of information. So what I'm saying is that they're collecting very, very detailed information about...
And is one of those check boxes the one that you were talking about, where it was saying, were they complicit? So
I'll tell you exactly what it says. So it's got all of the information of the victim, their congregation number, name of the congregation, whether they're a publisher, pioneer, etc., what their mother's status is in the organization, whether or not they're living with their parents, what the relationship is to the abuser, what the relationship is to other people that were involved. And then there's a line, and then there is about the allegations. That's a subtopic, about the allegations. And it says what specific acts are alleged. It says, you know, and then the elders would type that in, and it has categories. For example, sexual, neglect, emotional, sexting, physical, verbal, financial, or unknown. So they have to check the box, provide this information, and then it says when did the alleged acts occur? And then the very next line says, was the victim a willing participant?
Wow.
And I'm not going to read, there's a lot more. I'm not going to read the rest because I don't want to reveal any more information other than to say, this is cold hard evidence, sadly can't be released right now. And we want to protect the victims anyway. We have to. But what we don't want to protect is what Watchtower is doing. They are collecting an extensive database, which we've known all along. We know that, in fact, you even pointed out the other day that this book itself has a section that says, what, filing, I think, or...
Well, we're going to get to that.
Yeah,
that was
filing.
Something I pointed out to you privately,
Right.
and I'm hoping to bring out in this in this conversation. But the proof of the database, apart from the fact that you've actually bloody well seen some of it, the proof of the database is in the Shepherd book itself. If you know how to read it. But let's press on, shall we? Quick question, quick comment there from Isaiah David. Wow, insane that this database exists. Couldn't agree more with you there, Isaiah. So we have there paragraph 7, to ensure that elders comply with the child abuse reporting laws, 2 elders should immediately call the legal department for legal advice when the elders learn of an accusation of child abuse. This, Mark, is precisely the problem. The legal department gets to find out about it before the police do, and in some cases, in many cases, instead of the police finding out about it.
You know, Lloyd, one of the more disturbing things, and this is something else I at the moment I can't go into right now, but it will be released fairly soon. But I was working with some very high-level law enforcement agents, and I handed them a copy of an S-77 disfellowshipping form. And the copy that I handed them, and I have many, but I happened to hand them a copy of the disfellowshipping form of Max Reyes, who is the perpetrator in the Montana case. He's the one that fled to Mexico. And that's the $35 million judgment handed down on Watchtower. So, you know, this is a person who has been in law enforcement his entire life. He's been, you know, effectively cracking the skull of child abusers for almost his whole career. He read this, and it was several pages, disfellowshipping form. He read this and handed it back to me, and he said, my God, this looks like a police report. This looks like a police investigation, because this is a man who's been doing investigations the whole time. And I can mention this because that S-77 form is publicly available. You know, it's part of the Montana case. So it was one of the few pieces of evidence that were essential to providing the winning case to the plaintiffs in that case, Holly and Lexi. But they take down so much information, so detailed, and they report all of this to Watchtower, who enters that in their database. So I know it seems a little, shocking what I just said about, reading those items from the database, but I mean, come on. I mean, we all knew it was there. We all knew that they were.
Mark, we know, but the whole point of this channel is to bring this information to the light of people who cannot know about it because Watchtower's keeping them in the dark. So it's irrelevant in a way what we know. We need to let people know about it. And I understand, I'm not saying in any way you should be divulging stuff that you've been told not to divulge. I'm just grateful that we can know as much as we do know and try and get the word out. Let's try and make some progress, shall we, through the legal considerations. You have here a list of things, a list of basically criteria, you might say. The elders should call the legal department even in the following situations. And there's a number of situations listed. All of these seem fairly straightforward, apart from this one, which ruffled my feathers. The alleged abuse is believed to be a repressed memory. There's a whole load of kind of quackery and bunkum in Watchtower's publications about repressed memories and how they shouldn't necessarily be taken seriously. And this seems to be acknowledging the fact that a lot of this nonsense may have lodged itself in the minds of elders, and it's reminding them, irrespective of what we've told you in the past about repressed memories, we still want to hear about it.
I mean, yes, a couple of things on that. First of all, I mean, just what you're showing on screen there, just look at how long that list is. 10 different, very specific items about this is when the elders should call the legal department, even in the following situations. And they've got this detailed list, meaning they want to hear about it, which means they are collecting that information. They're typing that information, and it becomes a permanent record in their database. Now, regarding the repressed memories, look, I understand that it is possible in some rare cases for a child to come up with a memory that is considered a false memory. So I want to take you back to Arkansas. We've talked about the Arkansas case. Now, this came up in the Arkansas case. There is no question this man, Roderick Watkins, sexually abused all of these children over the course of many years. They weren't colluding with each other, but that was the defense's argument. The defense said these children all got together after this man was disfellowshipped, and they colluded with each other. And these memories were false memories that only popped up after they realized that he was disfellowshipped, and they wanted in on it. They had something against this man, so they jumped in on it, and they brought up these so-called repressed memories and said, well, this happened and that happened, and they didn't really happen. He even said the children's memories, or our memories, are not a recording device. And a few of the children who are now young adults who testified did mention that some of their memories were repressed. Now, this was not all of them. This was just a few. Got on the witness stand under oath and said that they had some repressed memories that just didn't come back until they started thinking about, and this happens all the time, and they started thinking about how they had been touched and this incident that they tried to block out. These repressed memories are very real, and this case actually proves that they are, because most of the people who testified never said repressed memories. Several of them did. All of their stories matched up completely. All of them matched completely. And in that mind, it really reinforced to me that repressed memories really are a thing. And, the defense tried to discredit these witnesses by saying things like he was polling the jury. And I think we talked about this before. He was polling the jury before they accepted them as jurors. And they said, well, has your son ever told you a lie? Or has he ever made up a story? And the woman said something like, well, yeah, one time my son said that he was, he killed a bunch of bears. he had an active imagination. This wasn't a repressed memory. Children do have active imaginations, but not when it comes to child abuse. And I mentioned one final point, and that is that Watchtower's, and I forget which issue it is, but Watchtower's own magazine says about child abuse that children do not make up stories about child abuse. And maybe somebody can look that up real quick and post it on the comment section, because I don't have that one in front of me. But Watchtower has already admitted that children don't make these stories up. So anyway, the point of this chapter is that Watchtower wants to collect all of that information, which should be handled by professional law enforcement and therapists.
Indeed. And just moving on down, you have there, again, the legal department has its fingers in everything. The legal department will provide legal advice based on the facts and the applicable law. Intriguing point 9 here, prison inmates. 2 elders should immediately call the legal department regarding any prison inmate, baptized or unbaptized, who has been accused of child abuse and who is now associating with a congregation. Of course, Mark, this is only a thing because Watchtower actively encourages witnesses to go into prisons and recruit from convicts, because, of course, convicts are, you could say, in a more of a, well, they're literally a captive
audience.
But they're also at a point in their lives where any sort of nonsense really might appeal to them. And as a result of having this policy of trying to recruit, actual criminals, they have to include this about, oh, well, what if one of these people that we're trying to recruit actually turns out to be already a pedophile?
Yeah, it's a very dangerous area when you go into marketing your religion to prison inmates. And look, I understand, everybody needs some sort of, or has a right to some sort of spiritual assistance. But the active marketing in prisons, and look, I live in Maryland. It happens here in Maryland. We had a case in my own congregation where a woman had committed a very violent crime. She was formerly a state trooper. She had committed a very violent crime and was in prison for at least 15 years, maybe more, but very long time. And the witnesses had their prison ministry, and they engaged this person, and they got out of prison and ultimately wound up in our congregation. But not everybody knew this story. The only reason I knew about this story was because I was very close friends with the elder and his wife who had studied with this woman, and they were from 30 minutes away. So all of the people who come into contact with this woman, and I'm not saying she was a child molester at all, but her crimes were of a violent nature. And no one in the congregation knows that except a very few amount of people. And she has full access to being around children and other adults. And you never know when a person like that could snap or commit a violent crime. And you're allowing both children and adults to be in close association. So the same principle applies to child abuse. A person like that could get out. And I think we're going to talk about, those loopholes in maybe another paragraph, but the prison ministry is, look, it's a dangerous thing when you go soliciting these individuals to be part of your faith.
Indeed. Everyone deserves a second break, but when your organization is already like a leaky bucket when it comes to dealing with child sex abuse, it becomes even more of an issue, you could argue. And you have here, just finally in this section, a paragraph on child pornography and sexting. I just want to highlight some of the wording here. If the elders become aware of an adult associated with a congregation who has been involved with child pornography, 2 elders should immediately call the legal department. And it also says, likewise, if the elders become aware of an adult or minor associated with a congregation who is sexting with a minor, the legal department should be called immediately. So they're saying here, don't go to the police if you find out that someone's involved in child porn. Don't go to the police if you find out that someone is sexting a minor. Let me contrast this material, and indeed the other material that we've been discussing, which is very vague on the need to involve the authorities at all, and jump to another chapter entirely. This is actually, I believe, chapter 20 on disruptive individuals. This is the procedure for if someone gets into a meeting and starts to cause a disturbance. Look what the direction is. The police will be contacted.
Yeah. Look, what can we say, Lloyd? They'll call the police
if the individual is violent from the outset, the police can be called immediately. Well, where are Watchtower's priorities, Mark? If they can't call the police immediately if they find out someone's sexting children, they can't call the police immediately if they find out someone's involved in child porn, they can't call the police immediately if they find out a child's been raped, but hey, someone's disrupting the meeting, call the cops.
And we have, extensive cases on YouTube where individuals have disrupted meetings. And, all you see there is these elders getting on the phone and contacting the police. And in some cases, the police come and immediately, why can't they do this with an offender? Now, I want to respond to what you said here about the sexting thing, because, look, I'm not trying to disparage my home state of Maryland and the congregations that I was part of, mostly the Perry Hall congregation in Baltimore, Maryland. But so many of these things are just really hit home for me personally. Like I mentioned the case a few minutes ago about an individual that came in from the prison ministry. But I mean, I can't begin to tell you how many cases of child sexual abuse and pornography, and even child pornography, that were part of my congregation's history. And in one case, and I never knew this, but in one case, a person that was a very close friend of mine was involved in some kind of child pornography, to the point where, look, only a few of the elders knew about it. And one of the elders actually told me, this is the same elder that came banging on my door, trying to disfellowship me for speaking out about child abuse. The same elder told me, oh yeah, that person so-and-so will never be appointed as an elder again. And look, I had been at the time I had been in the organization 40 years when he told me this. And I didn't fully understand, because I didn't have access to the elders. I wasn't an elder. I'd been a ministerial servant. So I didn't know how dangerous this guy, who was a very close friend of mine, was, and that he was involved in this certain type of questionable sexual pornography that, as it turns out, was quite serious. And later I noticed that he was around young girls all the time, actively around. He was picking them up and taking them in field service and taking them to events, like the Oregon Ridge concert held nearby. And I mean, my God, it was exactly like what I saw in Arkansas, where this man, Roderick Watkins, had ingratiated himself with all of these families. He groomed the families and then groomed the children. And he was taking these kids all over the place. He was taking them to meetings, to talks, because he was service overseer. He was giving talks all over the place. And it just shocked me how I found out this about this, other guy in my congregation, who was one of many who have committed acts of, either child sexual abuse or some kind of child pornography. It's sickening. And yet you're right, Lloyd, they find out about this. And I guarantee you, these people, they never contacted the police about this person that was a close friend of mine. And it shocks and scares me that happened.
1020 Red Dog says the sick irony of this is beyond words. I definitely relate to that. Isaiah Davids says, I can't bring myself to laugh at this. It enrages me. Also, 720 Red Dog also says, call the police on someone who disrupts meetings but not touching children. I don't know if you're an elder watching this, Mark. I don't know how you can escape from that. how do you hold your head high and say, yes, I'm proud of this organization, when you have that glaring double standard?
And that's the power of undue influence and control from an organization that, quite frankly, Lloyd, you and I were both under that spell. And, I think we have to admit to ourselves that we were being controlled by an organization that didn't have our best interests at heart. And we didn't know it was wrong. Now that we're out and we're free of that, everything has become crystal clear. But when you're in it, you don't know you're in it. You don't know you're in a cult. You don't know you're in an oppressive or mind controlling style of group or organization. And I do feel for the people who are still in and who are defending it. But the good news is that I mentioned before, we've had many elders reach out to us and say, I've had enough. I've had enough. And child abuse is becoming the touchstone for defining right and wrong. I mean, look, they can get away with overlapping generations and all of these doctrinal things because those are not things that directly involve the sexual assault of children and the cover up of those matters. But when you deal with something this serious, then a lot of these elders and others are drawing the line, and that's why they're reaching out to us. And in fact, so rapidly that it's difficult to keep up with those communications.
Cave World makes a similar point to you, Mark. It should be a natural thing to be able to spot when you're being manipulated and indoctrinated, unless you are so far gone like these people. As a rant, touching on the prison situation, my grandfather does prison witnessing, so he will speak to criminals who might have smothered puppies for fun, or obviously worse, but he won't speak to me. Just so much hypocrisy in this organization. Thanks also again for the super chats that are coming through, really helping the channel, very much appreciated. And I think what we'll do now is we'll move on to our next section. And because I can't yet afford a producer, let's just see here. Okay, I don't know whether I've picked up on this one from Friar Bellows. Call the police when someone disrupts a meeting. Why don't they do this when a child abuse case is reported? Yeah, understandable fury there. Let's just insert our banner so that when I am putting the timestamps, I know I can just glance through and see where we're up to. So we're now up to congregation considerations, and I need to go back to the original page because I've jumped forward in the book. So we now need page, and the pages aren't numbered, Mark. I don't know whether you've noticed that. So I actually had to insert page numbers so that I can
right.
I know where I'm up to. So we're now up to congregation considerations, which is just one paragraph, and it says, when discussing child sexual abuse from a congregation standpoint, we would, this is what we were talking about. We are not considering a situation in which a minor who is a willing participant and who is approaching adulthood is involved in sexual activity with an adult who is a few years older than the minor. It's almost as though, Mark, they don't understand what a minor is. According to the law, a minor under the law cannot be a willing participant.
Correct. So, I want to make it clear that the organization is lying when they say that a child or a minor would not be disciplined by the organization as a victim, and that is absolutely false. And we have many cases to back this up, and including going back to my own childhood. My first experience with a disfellowshipped person in this same congregation was a young girl who, had been sexually molested by this man who was 3 or 4 times her age, and they disfellowshipped the girl. She was around 15 years of age, no more than 16 at the most, and they disfellowshipped her. Now, same thing happened in Delaware. I think most people that watch our channel or read JW Survey are familiar with Delaware state of Delaware versus the Laurel Congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses. It was a 14-year-old baptized boy who was disfellowshipped after having sex more than 50 times with a woman who was more than twice his age. It was like an assistant school teacher. They were both baptized witnesses. The elders found out. Police were never called. It was actually the mother who ultimately called the police. But again, this is a position, this is a situation where a 14-year-old boy was disfellowshipped for being a willing participant. So they held him accountable for his sexual behavior rather than just letting the police handle it and letting him get the kind of therapy that this young person needed. So they believe that at a very, very young age, a child is what they call a mature minor, also a willing participant, but a mature minor. And this has to do with the blood policy as well, because they believe that a young person has a right to, especially if they're baptized, make a decision as a mature minor on refusing blood. And they believe the child has a right to be disfellowshipped for engaging in a sexual act with an adult or another minor. So they believe in accountability at very, very, very young ages, younger than you can even get a driver's license or smoke or vote or do any of these things. They believe in this level of accountability. So they don't have a grasp at all on the plasticity of the human brain and how it is developing from childhood all the way up at least until the age of 25 before the brain starts settling into a routine or a pattern that it doesn't deviate much from at that point. So it's astounding to me, Lloyd, that, and honestly, look, that's why you and I were baptized at, I was 16. You were even younger than that, I believe.
11, yeah. The second part of the paragraph says, nor generally speaking are we discussing situations in which only minors are involved. And then it uses some very odd wording. Rather, we are referring to an adult guilty of sexually abusing a minor who is a young child. And I've put in my notes, as opposed to a minor who is not a young child. Are the rules different there?
An old child? And who makes that determination? Who draws that line?
Exactly. Astonishing wording.
So this is why the service department makes that decision, not the local elders. This is why they're required to give all of that information, everything, to first the legal department for reporting purposes, which they never report, and then secondly to the service department, who goes into great depth of all of the factors involved, and they determine whether or not a child is considered a willing participant in a sexual act, and they determine whether or not
they even have a box to tick on their database. You were saying earlier,
willing participant. That word is used here in this book, and it's used in their database for reasons of consistency. Willing participant.
Miss Jen says you can't be a minor and legally be a willing participant. So disgusting that the organization would be so dismissive of a crime by blaming a child, even if a teenager. Sickening. And Anna Twink says approaching adulthood is a child. My sons are 14 and trust they are babies who still play with toys. I think she means trust me. Shame on Watchtower. 720 Red Dog says the cognitive dissonance and lack of being able to truly examine these horrific cases amongst the Jehovah's Witnesses is what keeps most elders and rank and file still thinking this is just a few bad apples. And John Sequoia says they are basically saying that a minor can give consent. Also, there is no definition of what approaching adulthood means. So just a one paragraph section, congregation considerations, and it's an absolute train wreck.
Great comments.
Yeah, they are good comments. Thank you very much to everyone watching. There's currently 461 watching on the live stream, which is even more than Cliff and I managed. So obviously the celebrity factor of having
on a Monday.
having Mark
On a
O'Donnell
Monday.
here.
It's a
Not
Monday.
Not wishing to demean Cliff in any way, and I have seen Cliff commenting as well. So thanks so much for joining us, Cliff.
Yeah, thank you, Cliff. You did a great job, and you're a lot more popular than me. You've got a great YouTube channel, and I had, by the way, shout out to Cliff because had a great time in Sydney, Australia with you. We spent a couple hours kind of wandering around the Sydney Opera House and had a great chat. So lovely guy and terrific person.
He is a lovely guy. So let's, and he has some very vocal dogs. Patches
is a little more quiet here. Did you want to add anything to that, Patches?
So the next section is providing spiritual assistance to victims. Now, there's some absolutely astonishing, well, there's already been astonishing wording, I realize that, but look at this first paragraph here. Elders should demonstrate empathy and compassion when anyone approaches them about a matter involving child abuse. Ongoing spiritual shepherding is especially important for victims of child sexual abuse and their families. So what they're saying, someone is abused, someone suffers child sexual abuse. What's especially important is that they receive shepherding from the elders. That's the priority here. Would you agree with that, Mark?
Yes,
you would right. You would agree with
Facetious. It. Yeah, facetiously. Yeah. So it is the worst possible thing that they can do. And look, when I came into this, I didn't know a lot several years ago when I knew about these emerging cases of child sexual abuse and how they hadn't been reported. But what I didn't know was just how bad it was when the elders spent so much time with child sexual abuse victims, either interviewing them or shepherding them. And one of the things I've learned from detectives and investigators, including the investigator in the Arkansas case who spent several hundred hours putting an elder behind prison for the rest of his life for what he did, was she told me that the elders obstructed her investigation so badly because they had interviewed these children. And by the way, there were at least 10 interviewed by the police. When they finally got to these children and interviewed them, a lot of these children had already been interviewed by the elders multiple times. And what she said to me is that is the complete polar opposite of their training. Their training is to interview victims of child abuse as little as possible, the fewest number of times. And there's a whole host of reasons why they do that. One of the things she did tell me was that, the memories of these children do develop over a period of time, meaning there's a trust factor. Okay, so already the children don't trust because they've been sexually molested by a perpetrator, and in this case, an elder. So they already have a trust problem. So when they finally get to talk to the police know for a fact that the child is not going to reveal everything all at once. It's going to come in stages as they build trust with that child. And to build trust with that child, they have to go through an extensive procedure. They have all sorts of methods of helping a child without frightening or endangering that child, things that the elders have absolutely no idea how to do. When I was walking into the courthouse one day, there was a therapy dog there that had come from one of the centers where children are interviewed. They use dogs. They take the children to a special place that is not a cold police station. It is a special building. It is all child friendly. It is designed with years and years of research using animals, using visual aids. I mean, it is so much work that is put into how to properly interview a child, and the elders destroy all of that. They wreck it because they interview these children on multiple occasions and they get them to tell what they did, whether or not they were complicit in the sexual act, whether they had their clothes on or not, whether they orgasmed or not, all of these things. It just re-traumatizes the child like you wouldn't believe. And it ends up causing them not to trust other adults, including law enforcement. So by the time the police finally get to interview these children, I mean, they're a wreck. They're going to need therapy for the rest of their lives. So the elders should never touch this. with a 100-foot pole under any circumstances. It should be the therapists that are trained, the law enforcement agents that are trained, professionals. And by the way, gender is a factor too, because you have some children that are female that need to be professionally assisted, not by a male elder, but by a professional female who is trained to understand how to interview and help such victims. Sorry for the long rant, but this is an important issue that we have to address, and people have to understand that these elders are doing far more damage than any good that they ever think that they're doing to help these victims of abuse.
No, it's a very justified rant, Mark, because we have here a section titled "Providing Spiritual Assistance to Victims." It may as well be titled interfering in criminal child sex abuse cases, because, as you say, elders are here inserting themselves in such a sensitive issue to the point where they're really, in a way, re-victimizing these children and victims. There's some incredible wording here in point 15, and if I've skipped any points for the sake of time, Mark, feel free to drag me back. But this really stood out for me. Though it may be necessary for the elders to ask a few tactful questions to help an afflicted one express herself, they should avoid probing unnecessarily or repeatedly into the details of the abuse. However, discussing biblical examples of others who endured a difficult childhood and yet succeeded in becoming faithful servants of Jehovah may provide needed comfort. In time, Jehovah God will heal the brokenhearted. We've got the solution, Mark. Don't worry yourselves about professional help. Read them some scriptures about Bible characters who endured a, quote, difficult childhood. That's the solution.
And what does that solution entail? It entails regular attendance at the meetings, regular Bible study, regular participation in field service, all of the things that tend to stress a child out to a great degree and place upon them an expectation that they will be part of this organization and its hierarchy and its pioneer structure and its elder structure and servant structure for the rest of their lives. There is no getting out of it. And
surely this is proof, Mark, that they simply do not understand how devastating child sex abuse is if the solution is for the abuse victim to compare their experience with a Bible character who's had a difficult childhood. Apparently, someone who endures this trauma, they're having a difficult childhood.
Look, I don't want to disparage persons of faith who rely upon Christian principles or other religious principles to guide their lives. But I think, it's no secret that the Bible contains horrific information regarding violence and misogyny and every possible thing that is not a proper example for a child. And children are exposed to this week in and week out through the pages of the Watchtower. And many of these things, remember, are triggers for a child. So if you take a child that is an abuse victim and you place them in the Kingdom Hall, and there's all of this, look how much talk there is about sexual contact. That's all the child is thinking, look, I've been, touched, I've been abused, they're harmed, they don't know what to think. They had an out-of-body experience almost, just looking down upon them being abused. Many of them describe that way. And then you throw them into a Kingdom Hall where they've got these all men controlling the congregation, reading about sex, and somebody was disfellowshipped here, immorality, that, all of this sexual contact, masturbation and orgasms and what's pornea, what's not pornea. Think about the attention they place upon that and how that can affect the mind of a very young child who is going to be triggered by that. it's devastating. I want to mention one thing that I feel is very important, and it's what I call the child counseling dilemma. Now, what I found, and we don't really have this so much, we have this a little bit in writing from Watchtower, where it's obvious they've got a real problem now. They have a dilemma of whether or not to interview a child with reference to their accusations that their father or stepfather, whoever, molested them, uncle, whatever. Okay, the reason I'm calling it the child counseling dilemma is that you have, let's say, two basic things that you have to consider. Number one, if you speak to the child, as I've discussed before, you can obstruct the police investigation, and police do not take that lightly. Okay, so already we recognize from what's in this book here that Watchtower is becoming aware that speaking to children can be a real problem. And they've actually said, well, only in certain cases, if the service department approves it, will allow a child to be spoken to. Okay. However, what's the flip side of that? If they don't speak to a child, then you have a case where you really don't have direct evidence that would contribute to a child molester being disfellowshipped from the congregation. And I say that because, for example, an elder recently reached out to me and said that there were several children that had been abused by their own biological father, and he was told not to contact the police. But then he said, well, we're going to comfort the children and provide them some spiritual ability. Contacted the service department, and they said, don't talk to those children. So that sounds like a good thing, right? And it is. Elders should not be involved in speaking to these children. However, the flip side of that is that this man who sexually abused all three of his biological children is running the streets free as a non-disfellowship person. And it was only because a family member contacted the police that there's a police investigation. The elders never contacted the police. So again, we have this dilemma where Watchtower is in a very precarious situation right now, where they're saying, maybe we shouldn't talk to children. We're learning that that's a bad thing. But child molesters are not often being disfellowshipped for their crimes from the congregation because of that very reason. So to me, it emphasizes the fact that they shouldn't be involved in this at all. And it all goes back to what you said earlier, Lloyd, was just the whole thing could be summed up in one sentence.
Child abuse is a crime. That's what you need in the chapter. Gosh. Okay, so moving on to the next paragraph. This is where we learn about the aversion, really, to mental health professionals. So look at this wording here. This is talking about shepherding visits and about how elders will want to think about limiting how much time they spend speaking to child sex abuse victims because of how much work will be involved. And then it says it may take several visits to assist a victim effectively. Again, it's pointing to elders as being the effective way of assisting a victim rather than trained mental health professionals. And at the end of the paragraph, it talks about reading a scripture, offering a prayer, and it says, this will confirm the elder's interest and willingness to help to the extent possible. And I've put in my notes, ... even if they're shielding the abuser from authorities.
Yeah, I look, this following these Bible principles, I almost feel like, again, they're speaking out of both sides of their mouth when they say what you just read. On the one hand, they're cautioning elders against speaking to certain victims of abuse if they are minors. But on the other hand, this paragraph talks about a victim speaking to the elders and that it may take several visits to assist a victim effectively. So let's ask that question. Are they saying we're only talking about adult victims of abuse speaking to the elders on multiple occasions? So that again, that's where we have this thing where the service department makes the decision of what the elders do, whom they speak to. In the case that I just mentioned, where you have 3 children, those 3 children are all baptized minors, very young, like
I guess what really leaves a sour taste in the mouth, though, is the pretense of concern, the pretense of wading in and solving things, while all the while, in case after case, they are literally withholding the individual who's done this to them from the authorities and from due process, from the rule of law, so that more victims can be accrued. It's putting the cart before the horse somewhat, isn't it?
Yeah, and I mentioned earlier about the power of suggestion or even the power of omission. So you look at these references here. Let's see, which paragraph is this? Where it talks about. I'm going to make sure I'm on the right one here. It talks about if an elder is asked for advice on this matter, he may direct attention to appropriate Bible principles and material in our publications. And then it gives a reference to which Watchtower articles. There's one from 2015. There's one from 2008. So, for example, the one from 2008 says, in view of the foregoing, if we have doubts about some diagnostic or therapeutic procedure, we would be wise to reject it. So I just want people to understand, Watchtower is saying, if we have some doubts about a therapeutic procedure or diagnostic procedure, meaning a professional therapist, for example, we would be wise to reject it. And even though they say it's a personal or conscience matter, the fact of the matter is that everything about Watchtower's teachings is, look, we are inside this bubble. We're not part of the world. So be careful. Don't go out there.
Why would you want to go to worldly wisdom
right.
to navigate your way through this?
Right. So we're not dealing with, growing up, including myself and you growing up, we didn't have a full set of cards that we could really play, because we were told that outside worldly wisdom was false. And it creates this doubt about professional therapists, about police officers. It creates a mistrust of the world from the very people who really are trying to help these children and protect them.
It must just be mentioned that this paragraph that you've alluded to does mention, or at least offer the possibility of victims or their families consulting a mental health professional. But the way that they do it, in my opinion, is very clever. It says, in addition to the spiritual shepherding provided by the elders. So the spiritual shepherding provided by the elders, that comes first. That's top of the pile. What are the other alternatives? The victim or her family may desire other assistance. For example, example 1, an adult sister who suffered abuse as a child may choose to approach an empathetic sister for emotional support and encouragement. That seems to be the preferred option of the 2 options that I'm now reading, because you then have, or the victim or her family may decide to consult a mental health professional. You can just leave the full stop there, Mark. Instead, it just says, whether a victim or her family pursues treatment from psychiatrists, psychologists, or therapists is a personal decision. Now, an apologist reading this could say, you're being cynical, Lloyd, because it's giving both of these equally as options. It's not dismissing either option, and it's not dismissing the mental health option. But isn't it precisely the point that top of the list you've got the elders and their shepherding, then you've got these 2 alternatives, and a sister, an empathetic sister in the congregation, is being given level pegging with a mental health professional.
That's absolutely the case, and that's really you've got this hierarchy of, look, let the elders handle things first. They're the shepherds of the congregation, even though they have no real training at all. Most of them are plumbers and electricians or carpenters or tradesmen. So you have their shepherds, And then, oh, by the way, if you happen to need a female voice, okay, well, we can allow this victim to speak to a sister in the congregation, a respected sister, but why not just go straight to a mental health professional or therapist? But again, like you said, it's almost equal pegging anything but a worldly authority to help out. If the elders can't help, or you need a sister, a woman, go to a woman in the congregation who, by the way, also has no professional training unless they happen to work in that field. So you could have just...
But at least she's under the power and authority
Yes.
of the elders. And
Yes.
You've already pointed out that final sentence where if they are serious about consulting a mental health professional, see what the publications have got to say. That may shed a bit more light on it. And then you go to the publications, and again, you have this thinking of why would you want to defer to worldly wisdom and that kind of thing.
And one final point on that is that you've broken privilege again. So not only have you got all of these elders discussing it,
you've included an empathetic sister in the clergy penitent, I don't know, sphere that you've created.
Right. Broken again.
So yeah, honestly, it's not surprising to me that the Shepherd book was used to dismantle that myth that clerical and privilege applies, because it's all through the book if you know where to look. Let's just take a break for the benefit of our own sanity, so that we can bring in a few comments. The respected sister would no doubt be an elderette. That's Steen 1. Eyes on the prize says, if you have been around the JW culture long enough, you know exactly what is okay and not okay in the minds of everyone. That's why you get the same generic responses that you can easily get. Nadine Figueroa Bay says, anyone who ever was associated with Jehovah's Witnesses needs therapy afterwards. Well, that's true, Nadine, although arguably it's a whole other matter when we're talking about child sex abuse, as I'm sure you'll agree. And A. Lev says, yes, but if both have suffered, both are victims, and victims find some comfort in each other. I think that might actually be a response to someone else's comment. 720 Red Dog says, when I told my still-in mother I was going for therapy, she had a look of disgust on her face. It is so ingrained in the Jehovah's Witnesses to think therapy is something that is bad. It seems to be obvious to those who know anything about Jehovah's Witnesses that the professional therapy is severely frowned upon, Mark.
It's stigmatized. And not only that, but they forget the fact that these elders are human as well. And they also suffer from depression. We had elders in my congregation who were medicated for depression and anxiety, and they had to take something every day. In fact, my best friend, who is now a circuit overseer, has been on depressants for 14, 15 years, can't function without them. And there's a reason that's very serious. And these type of medications are often not meant to be long-term medications. So you've got elders themselves who are, on the one hand, counseling others, but on the other hand, many of them haven't dealt with their own anxieties, problems, and issues that they haven't dealt with, and they're put in the pressured position of being a spiritual counselor to someone and dealing with something they should never have to deal with, which is child sexual abuse. That's got to be handled by qualified professionals. Why doesn't Watchtower just take that burden off of them and let the professionals handle it, and these elders can just get back to being, what clergy members are supposed to do?
Lou Knight, I think, deserves an award for their avatar. That's a very impressive avatar. And they say exactly, these are not trained mental health professionals. Imagine asking a bus driver or Trader Joe's stock boy for vital advice about child sex abuse. Very well said. We must now, though, proceed, make some progress. I've been hearing "make progress" a lot, Mark, because I've been watching Parliament. That's what they say when they're being interrupted. I must make progress. Investigating allegations is the next section under discussion. Let's bring the Shepherd book back up. And we're looking now at paragraph 18. I've highlighted this sentence. These elders should follow carefully. This is what talking about the kind of the mindset or the approach when it comes to investigating allegations of abuse. It says elders should carefully follow scriptural procedures and the Bible-based direction in this chapter and in chapter 12. And I think what we can both agree on, Mark, is that when it says scriptural procedures, what they mean is the two-witness rule.
Yeah, and boy, they just won't let go of that two-witness rule, will they? You know, as the service department overseer Gary Bro said, and I think it was 2 years ago, just under 2 years ago, he said, we will never change our scripturally based position on that.
But why can't they be clear in the wording that that's what? I think we know why. It's because they know how incriminating it will sound. So they instead use code language where, again, scriptural procedures, an elder will read that and immediately know that what they mean is the two-witness rule. And
well, I think that's an accurate, absolutely, because
it's actually spelled out further on in the paragraph. It says a victim of child sex abuse. Oh, sorry, this is talking about something else, but I will come back to the two-witness rule. It says a victim of child sexual abuse is not required to make her allegation in the presence of the alleged abuser. Generally, elders should be able to obtain necessary information from the parents. Now, this is interesting, Mark, because they've introduced. I think it's difficult to pin down exactly when this was introduced. It seems to have been either shortly before the Royal Commission or shortly after it, where they said, okay, we're not going to require victims to present evidence in front of the abuser. But what you then have, in a strange way, is the possibility that the victim is worse off. Hear me out here, because the elders have even less information to go on, because they are rightly not allowed to bring the victim in and make them confront the abuser. They are then, by their rules, in which the two-witness rule is front center, they have their hands tied because they have less information to go on in reaching what you could say is a guilty verdict. And that's kind of spelled out here, where it says, in addition, sufficient evidence needed to establish wrongdoing on the part of an alleged abuser may already be available to elders. So it's saying, don't worry if you can't bring in the victim and make them confront the accused, because there's other ways of finding things out. But when you actually look up this section here, chapter 12, points 40 to 42, these other ways turn out to be the accused confessing or a second victim, and that's it. So it seems to me that there's any number of ways under this that the accused just gets off scot-free.
Well, think about what they're doing there, Lloyd. If they cover their ears and they say, we didn't speak to the child, we didn't hear these, then what does that do for them legally? That gives them the opportunity to escape mandatory reporting. So you've got a situation where now they're realizing, well, maybe we shouldn't speak to these children directly, because if we hear it directly from the child, then we are therefore extra complicit if we don't contact the legal authorities. So that's part of mandatory reporting. They, if they're just hearing it secondhand from the parents, they're going to tell the parents that they have the absolute right to report. But look, this is all designed to protect themselves legally. So
but the parents weren't there. The parents are going off what the child has said, and understand and right.
Secondhand.
Wonderful. I think it's wonderful that victims are no longer required to confront their abuser. That's absolutely the right thing. But what
if they're a minor.
The problem that we have, if they're a minor, sorry, yeah, no, I don't. Not just if.
I understand what you're saying, right?
Yeah.
No, I understand. Go ahead.
The problem that we have, though, is that the procedures are so narrow that once you've eliminated that means of establishing what's happened, what are you left with? And when you look up Chapter 12 of the other ways that elders can establish wrongdoing, it's literally just the accused confesses, or there's another victim, and that's pretty much it. And it even says at the end, kind of anticipating that this won't be enough, it says, in the exceptional event that the two elders believe it is necessary to speak with a minor who is a victim of child sexual abuse, the elders should first contact the service department. And then we have vagueness, because goodness knows what the service department's going to decide. It's a train wreck.
Well, it is a train wreck, Lloyd, because look, let's take confession out of it, because most child molesters don't confess. Now, there are some cases where they have confessed, and that's why they got in so much trouble with Montana, for example. They lost a $35 million lawsuit because this guy, Max Reyes, confessed, and then all the other stuff came out, and they got a hold. And by the way, it was very difficult for them to get hold of the S-77 form. But let's throw confession out of it. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about the fact that the elders are saying that they can potentially handle it on secondhand information. So a mother comes and says, my child says that their stepfather touched me. And then you still have nothing. So then let's say another mother in the congregation comes forward and she says that same perpetrator touched her child. So now they have their two witnesses, but do they really have two witnesses? They don't have two witnesses. They have two secondhand reports from parents who claim that their child made this report. Now, I'm not diminishing the child's report. Of course, you have to believe the victims. These things did happen, but they're protecting themselves legally in a sense, because they're kind of closing their ears to this and saying that, well, we have other ways of handling it judicially. But can you imagine if they took secondhand reports to disfellowship a person in the case of some other infraction?
The problem they have is that the other ways that they have of handling things don't involve the police or law enforcement. So they're left with, is there a second witness, which there almost never is? Is there a second victim, which there needn't necessarily be? And by the way, the two victim rule simply makes it possible for a pedophile to accrue a second victim because you haven't intervened the first time. And maybe the accused will confess. It's disturbing.
It's a corrupt. It's a corrupt web.
How much the organization are tying the hands of elders in these issues, bearing in mind what's at stake, namely that if they can't take this person seriously as a child abuser, then they're not going to consider it something that they should report to the authorities.
Well, it's a good thing, Lloyd, we have this nice thick book to explain it all. Makes it so simple, doesn't it?
Well, I don't know how you're doing for time, Mark, but are we okay taking another break, or do we need to press on?
Let's we've got time here. My okay. Cat hasn't asked me to feed her yet, so
everything's dependent, viewers, on Mark's cat. They hold the destiny of this live stream in their paws.
I think I had one knocking at the door, but she may have already gone out shopping for some cat food, so we're good for a few minutes.
Indeed.
No, we're fine. Let's get some comments.
there's currently 450 who are tuned in, and I'm just trying to quickly scroll through. Chrissy Cat, in reply to another viewer, says, I was a victim and was told to pray more. It's very just disgusting, really, to think that that is the sort of solution. Bible Girl says, forensic methods to establish guilt or innocence. The two witness rule should only apply to petty issues and not crimes. Yeah. Very well said. Let's just scroll up a little bit more. And Bible Girl also says, I think this might be the first part actually. The two witness rule in the Old Testament was used by the Apostle Paul regarding accusations against an elder in the church. This was done to protect the elder against false accusations. I think really, Bible Girl, it's mostly an Old Testament. When you said elder, no, Old Testament is not what the Apostle Paul was writing in. The New Testament, Mark, doesn't really have the two witness rule unless you invoke Matthew 18, which Watchtower tries to do, and that's just they themselves admit that Matthew 18 isn't for gross sin.
Yeah, but I do agree that they invoke that principle of having more than one witness to establish a matter.
Yeah. David Stevens says, keep up the good work that you do. Maybe one day we can take this evil cult down. So yeah, a lot of comments there, and I really do appreciate the thoughts that you're sharing and the fact that you're with us through this fairly demoralizing examination of this terrible book. Eyes on the Prize has only one word for us, Mark, and that is sick. So I think that is, sorry, I've just flashed it there. There we go. And now I'll take it off again. So,
it's an amazing that we have this conversation with this many people viewing and interested in it. And ultimately thousands of people will watch the discussion and have a chat about it and maybe read this manual. It's available online. And but look, how many other religions have this kind of manual? I think one of the things that we discovered when we were interviewing in Australia, if I can mention that we interviewed Angus Stewart and another government official who did all the research on Jehovah's Witnesses before that was even given to Angus Stewart in the Royal Commission. They made a point to us during the interview that they were really actually shocked by the fact that the Jehovah's Witnesses had all of their information collected in one place, meaning here and in their policy letters, whereas other religions that they investigated, and they investigated a large swath of groups from the religious groups, Catholics, YMCA, many other groups. And all of these groups had their information scattered in various places. So it was difficult for them to kind of put together a solid policy. But yet, because Watchtower is such a insular controlling organization, they've just put all of this together in these books, and they continue to update them so that it's all in one place. And yet, that seems organized, but it's all madness. It's just madness when you can sum it up, as we said before, with just child abuse is a crime, and we're talking about madness.
I think that the Shepherd book is almost inevitable for an organization that claims or desires the power and control that Watchtower insists on, because how can you micromanage how tight someone's pants are and not micromanage what they're doing in their sex lives or other areas of their life? Once you get to a certain point of wishing to insert yourself in people's lives, it's almost inevitable that you're going to end up with a rule book that's over 200 pages long. How can you not? Because that's the level of control that you you're after. But I am hoping that by having this discussion and the discussion with Cliff and the discussion that I will be having with Sherry, my plan is that, number one, we can give some pushback to this nonsense, but also just show it, because how many witnesses even know that this book exists, or even that there's a possibility for them to see what's in it. So just by having these videos online, I'm hoping that we'll at least get the discussion moving a little bit.
I think you raise a good point about the books, because when the organization developed from the late 1800s with Charles Taze Russell all the way through 1931, when they were called Jehovah's Witnesses under J.F. Rutherford, up to that point, they still didn't have secret elders manuals, at least that I'm aware of. They didn't have secret manuals that could only be viewed by congregation elders. That didn't come about until much later. Much of it was under Nathan Knorr. And even in my own personal collection, I have lots of information from the 40s, 50s, and 60s, where they had, for example, organization instructions and things that were produced that were not secretive, but they were meant for the body of elders, and it was out in the open. And they even had little pages where they would update the sectional disfellowshipping. These are little 32 or 64-page council books, but a congregation publisher could get their hands on one of those. It wasn't secretive like this. So it wasn't until we get into the formation of the governing body in the early 1970s, as well as the production of the Shepherd. It was the Pay Attention to Yourselves and All the Flock book, that it became a highly kept secret, these books.
You could argue that this level of control, though, has been in the organization's DNA from the beginning, because I'm looking in my collection at the book What Pastor Russell Said, which actually isn't a Watchtower book, it's a Bible student book, but it's a list of all the answers that he gave to questions when he was going around on his tours. And some of the questions that people were asking him, his followers that is, were things like, is it okay for me to engage in correspondence with a pen pal, and that kind of thing? And they were basically handing over on a plate control over their lives. And rather than Charles Taze Russell saying, don't be silly, you can decide that sort of thing for yourselves, he was giving them his serious. So this level of involvement in people's lives, I would argue, has been there from the very beginning, and it's kind of almost a logical progression that we have the Shepherd book in the 21st century.
I don't disagree with that, Lloyd. I do agree with that. The only difference, I think, is simply in the forced secrecy, the fact that they're now told they cannot read.
That's true.
Whereas
there was at least some transparency in Russell's time.
Yeah, you could pick up a copy of What Pastor Russell Said, whether you were a woman, child, or man, and you could read that book. It was readily available, but not so the Shepherd book, which is produced now by Watchtower of Korea.
Oh yeah, what's the deal with that? Do you know? I noticed that on the copyright page it says what's it say now?
Yeah, Watchtower
Bible and Tract Society of Republic of Korea Incorporated Association. Why have they put that?
Look, I don't. I have speculation. I don't have the perfect explanation for that. We know that Watchtower is extremely litigious, and that they're trying to protect their copyrighted works. And this is a highly secretive copyrighted work, but it's not the only.
It wouldn't look out of place in North Korea, would it? That's for sure.
Not at all.
So, Judicial Committee, Section 19. Here you have again this code word for the two-witness rule. If the body of elders concludes that there is sufficient scriptural evidence, they could have just said if the body of elders concludes that the two-witness rule is satisfied, but they know that. I think they know that. Outside bodies and courts and commissions are going to be poring over this, just as we're poring over it. You also have here this sentence: if wrongdoing is established and the wrongdoer is not repentant, he should be disfellowshipped. And in my notes I've put, if the two-witness rule is paramount, where are they getting their evidence from? Are child abusers being let off? Which goes back to what we were saying earlier, that they've kind of tied their hands in how how they can even get evidence, how they can even establish the wrongdoing, so that probably child abusers aren't being disfellowshipped.
I just can't get out of my head, Lloyd, the sitting there in an Arkansas courtroom and watching this distraught mother of one of the victims running out of the courtroom, bawling her head off in tears, because it was just revealed that this guy, Roderick Watkins, had a sexual contact with or sexually touched a 20-year-old Bethelite when he was in about 1988, when he was a Brooklyn Bethelite. He was a waiter there. The elders, this information, he was dismissed immediately from Bethel. He and his wife dismissed from Bethel. Less than 3 years later, he's an elder. Now, he claims that it was a consensual act, and he ran to the elders first so he wouldn't get disfellowship. So he was reproved. And we don't know that it was, I don't have the evidence of whether it was private reproof or public reproof. Those documents haven't come out yet. But one way or another, he was kicked out of Bethel. He was reproved. So this information goes with him to every congregation. He wound up first going back to Shelby, North Carolina. Then he winds up in Missouri, Sedalia, Missouri, in Indiana, within a 3-year period. And he's an elder again. Well, he had been a ministerial servant, but he's an elder again. Winds up living in the Kingdom Hall as a as a service overseer and an elder with his wife in the Kingdom Hall apartment in Indiana. And this is where, he began, well, he didn't begin abusing, but this is where he had access to all of these children, because in fact, I believe it was in 1998, the Watchtower had initiated a program called the Pioneer Assist Program. And the service overseer managed that program, and he was the service overseer. So he managed.
He used it as an opportunity to get more victims. Yeah. He
used it, and he could control the victims he had access to, molested them right there in the Kingdom Hall apartment and elsewhere. But by the time he gets to Arkansas, these elders know his past. And this is why the woman running out of the courtroom, because they knew that he had engaged with touching other young men. Didn't say it was a minor, but it was at least a 20-year-old. And I'm sure more is going to come out. But a 20-year-old male in Brooklyn, Bethel. And this woman knew at that point in the trial in Arkansas last month that the elders were aware that he did this. And this is what he did to her son. And she was just distraught. I felt so bad for her, because everyone in that courtroom was just, visibly upset. And this is her son, who left the religion, by the way, and he attributes the mishandling of the child abuse to why he left. Because he had gone to those elders and told them what this man did to him, and they didn't believe him. He went several years ago and told them. And, his dad was up on the witness stand just bawling his eyes out. I failed my son, he said. I failed my son. I felt so terrible for all these people that were just horrified, because the elders knew this. They knew it. They contacted Watchtower to do it. Yeah.
This is one of the reasons why I'm glad that, you could join me for this live stream, Mark, is because quite apart from having studied and researched these issues, you've also been kind of on the front lines in many of these cases, and you've seen very visceral examples of the impact these policies are having. I do want to just kind of move forward to some really, really chilling stuff. In this part here of the paragraph, let me see if it will respond. It says, on the other hand, if the wrongdoer is repentant and is reproved, the reproof should be announced to the congregation at the next midweek meeting. This announcement will serve as a protection for the congregation. I think it was picked up, wasn't it, in the Australian Royal Commission. How on earth can it be a protection for the congregation if they're literally just announcing so-and-so has been reproved? How is that supposed to protect the congregation? And before you comment,
Yeah.
please incorporate into your comment also what we were already talking about. Again, you have this concept of a minor who is a willing participant. Call the service department.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think
You
some
have
of
to
these
laugh.
things,
You have to laugh so that you don't cry. I guess it's just, you know.
yeah. Well, again, it, you know, it kind of goes back to the that Arkansas case when I discovered that there were victims in Indiana. And by the way, that discovery on my end didn't happen until the JW Survey article, and then a whole bunch of people came forward, including family members of a victim who is, you know, brutally you know, drugged and raped in Indiana, and when by the same pedophile. And when the elders in Arkansas finally were informed by a family member that this man committed this crime in Indiana, they wanted immediately to interview the victim because he was no longer a minor at that point. And they wanted to ask him all sorts of questions. And one of the questions that they tried to ask him immediately was, when this happened, were your clothes on or off? This was because it's, I mean, I don't know if I need to explain this or not, but the elders were trying to determine whether he was a willing participant. And remember, they already have the information that this man committed what they call a homosexual act in Brooklyn, Bethel. So they're starting to put this together, and they call Watchtower, obviously, they, you know, and then they start figuring out whether they should disfellowship this person or not. And they end up calling Indiana. And fortunately, the family members of the victim were very much trying to protect this person, which I greatly appreciate. And, you know, and if you're watching or listening now, you know, I have a lot of respect for what you did to protect, you know, your husband and your brother in this case. And they wanted to ask all of these intense, detailed questions, including, were you naked? Were your clothes on or off when this happened? Because they felt that they might have a case for disfellowshipping the individual in Indiana for a complicit sexual affair with this Roderick Watkins, if you can believe this. And again, he was a minor, you know, he was 15 or 16 at the most at the time this happened. They wanted to see whether or not they were going to handle him judicially. And by the way, this is a person who has suffered his entire life with severe psychological trauma from what happened to him. It was severe. It was bad. And all they can think to ask is, were you a willing participant? Were your clothes on or off? I mean, it is just absolutely disgusting. And I'm sorry if I went off track here a little far from the paragraph.
No, it is disgusting. And it also, again, highlights the fact that Watchtower doesn't seem to understand how these things work, doesn't seem to understand. Well, they think that child sex abuse is a difficult childhood. And they think that minors can be willing participants. So bottom line, they just don't have a clue, do they, what child sex abuse actually is, never mind how to deal with it. Apostle Babe, Linda James, they're saying this is what blind obedience looks like, and why it is referred to as drinking the Kool-Aid. SW says these stories are heartbreaking. It shows the real human cost. Our hearts go out to all affected. And Huisin, I don't know how you pronounce that. One of our viewers says, I hate the book and I'm happy you are outing it. It will help many. So yeah, that's what we're attempting to do. And with that in mind, I'm going to move us on, Mark, to the next section, which is, let's just see here. Okay, so we're now up to the Reinstatement Committee. And there wasn't really a great deal that I wanted to comment on here, although I do think because we were talking before about the involvement of the service and legal departments, and I think that's blindingly obvious here, just how much they have their fingers in the pie here, because it's talking about what to do once let's say the child abuser gets disfellowshipped. What happens if they seek reinstatement? And here it's saying if the decision is to reinstate, 2 elders serving on the committee should immediately call the service department. And then later on, it's talking about similar thing, really. If that committee agrees to reinstate, 2 elders, I think this is talking about when there are 2 different congregations involved. That's it. So the abuser has moved to a different congregation than the original one. If that committee agrees to reinstate, 2 elders from each congregation's committee should immediately call the service department. They have their fingers in everything, Mark, but when push comes to shove, they'll blame it on the individual elders.
And once again, we have another case of where if this crime had not been handled by law enforcement, still you have Watchtower's service department and several congregations discussing the case of this crime that occurred. And again, it breaks privilege because you've got all these people that know about it, and they shouldn't know about it. It's traumatizing enough for a victim to have his parents or her parents know about what happened to them. I mean, for anyone who's gone through it, and we've interviewed people that have come forward and said they want to talk about their abuse, it's traumatic. And it takes a victim or a survivor of abuse sometimes many years before they can ever talk about it. And for them to have to discuss it with not only their parents, but then a body of elders, and then a second, they're not going to be expected to talk to a second body of elders. But the fact is that that information then gets passed from one group of men to another group of men to Watchtower in New York. And you've got this large group of men, and Jehovah's Witnesses is a tight-knit organization. So while they claim to keep this all confidential, you might end up having 20 or 30 men who know about your personal experience with being sexually abused. Do you really want all these men knowing about that? You're being raped all over again. You have no control in this situation because you don't pick who's on the Judicial Committee, the Appeal Committee. You don't know any of these men in the service department. They never reveal their names. The legal department men are all completely anonymous. They do that to protect themselves legally. They never give their names. Not even I want to make this clear. When the elders call the legal department, they are given a code. They are not given a name of a legal person. It's very, very rare. It's 99 out of 100 times they have a code to refer to to reference this case. It's all in a database. It's all kept in the database. So do you really, as a victim, a survivor of abuse, want all these men to know about what happened to you just so that they can handle things the way they want to handle it? I think most people can answer that for themselves.
Indeed. We must move on to the next part, which is dealing with, as you can see there, restrictions. Now, there were a few things that I picked up on here. First of all, you again have the service department involved. And how on earth can Watchtower blame it on the elders when they've literally said here, the elders should carefully adhere to all direction provided by the service department. And then it says, for example, the service department will provide direction when, one, it is determined that a publisher, baptized or unbaptized, who is guilty of child sexual abuse is repentant and will remain in the congregation. Mark, for me, this is one of the foundational problems with Watchtower's entire approach to child sex abuse, this notion that a pedophile can be sorry.
So Lloyd, let me tell you a little story for the benefit of the people that are listening. I served as a ministerial servant for 10 years, and I had a number of, quote, privileges in the organization. And one of them was conducting a congregation book study at the Kingdom Hall every Thursday. And it was the morning book study. So the reason that they had this morning book study there was that, number one, it was great for the older folks in the congregation because they didn't want to go out on a Thursday night. Okay, so they had a morning book study. And secondly, it was for any reproved or disfellowship persons who could not go into a private home, because remember, the book study was held in private homes. So they had to have a congregation book study so that these persons who were disfellowshipped or reproved could attend. All right. So they put me in charge of this for a little over a year, studying that wonderful Revelation book.
Did you conduct the meeting?
I did. I was.
How did you take comments from people who were disfellowshipped, or did you just read the paragraphs and go through it?
Well, I didn't. So this is the point of the whole story. So the elders came to me and said, "We're giving you this book study, and we trust you, and we just need to tell you a couple of things. Number one, Sister XYZ, we'll just call her Jane Smith, okay? Sister Jane Smith, we can't tell you why, but she's been reproved and she's not permitted to comment." The end. That was all I was told. I wasn't told what her offense was. I didn't know what her offense was. There was nothing mentioned to me about whether or not she could be around children, not be around children. None of that. All I knew is that she had been publicly reproved and that she was not to comment and that I was not to call on her. Okay. So I was the congregation, the Kingdom Hall book study conductor, and I took the group out in field service as well. And obviously, a person that is reproved is under restrictions for various things, commenting. And so without getting into too much detail, so you have, this person who years later, I leave the religion and I start investigating child abuse, and I go to the Fessler trial and I report on that. And someone picks up on the fact that I reported on that in a Facebook group, and she contacts me and says, I want to write a book about my abuse because I was molested in the Perry Hall, Kingdom Hall that we attended, all right, when she was 4 or 5 years old. And she describes to me in graphic detail what happened, and I didn't solicit this information. She came to me and said, "I want to tell you what happened. I want to get this off my chest. I want to write a book about it, etc." She comes to me and tells me in graphic detail what this sister who was in my book study did to her, and it was horrendous. And I thought to myself, my God, this is the same person that the elders came to me as a ministerial servant, not as an elder, and said to me what she had done. And I could have easily, and this person is still very much in the organization, is still very active in multiple congregations, has lots and lots of contact with children. And yet here's a victim who has come to me and told me this. So, of course, the first thing I did was I said, you've got to talk to the police. You've got to. And I helped her do that. She got in touch with the police corporal, and they started investigating the case. And I'm not going to get into it any further than that, other than to say that this is one of the many loopholes where you can have a serial child molester, or just a child molester, whatever, a child abuser in a congregation where even people in authority, like myself as a ministerial servant conducting a book study, taking the group out in field service with a semi-level of authority, have no idea of what this person did. And I don't even know for a fact that that's what she was reproved for, but you can kind of put 2 and 2 together and understand that something quite serious happened. And this person has come to me and said, this is what happened. So look, Lloyd, it's disturbing because
what's ironic, Mark,
so much of this goes on.
We're dealing with a section here called restrictions, and it's just so twisted because Watchtower seems to think that they can restrict pedophiles. This whole section here is talking about all the ways Watchtower thinks that elders can protect the congregation from pedophiles, and it's absolutely strewn with loopholes and things that a determined predator, ways that a determined predator could find their way through it. So let's look at section 23 or paragraph 23. This is talking about you know, when someone accused of, someone accused of child sex abuse gets reinstated into the congregation. So they're back in circulation, so to speak. And it says, in such cases, direction from the service department to the elders will include restrictions imposed on the individual's activities within the congregation, on his participation in the field ministry, and on his interaction with minors. The elders will be directed to caution the individual never to be alone with a minor, not to cultivate friendships with minors, not to display affection for minors, and so forth. Mark, this amounts to elders assuming that they can stop a pedophile from preying on children, or indeed talk a pedophile into not being a pedophile. Again, I just don't think they understand how this works. No matter how much power and authority elders have, they simply are not physically in a position to be making sure these people don't prey on children.
Most of them have full-time jobs. We even read earlier that, or no, maybe we didn't get to this point yet, but the book mentions the fact that elders can't be there for everyone, meaning that their time is limited. So they can't have extended counseling sessions because the organization knows they have full-time jobs, most of them, and that they are doing all these other congregation responsibilities, taking the group out, studying, preparing talks, doing all of the things that are designed to keep Jehovah's Witnesses busy. So they can't possibly monitor individuals. The only thing they can do is make a false show of it by, look, I've had people come to me and say, oh yeah, we knew that this guy was a known child abuser in congregation XYZ. And so we kept an eye on him. In fact, we even followed him into the bathroom if he went into the bathroom. So that's convenient to them because it's during a congregation meeting when they're going to be there anyway. But that doesn't take into account the hundreds of hours this person, male or female, has access to other children. And on top of that, it doesn't protect persons who are not witnesses. And that is one of the most disturbing things. I mentioned it earlier. Organization honestly doesn't care about persons that are outside of the organization, even though they're preaching to them and trying to bring them in. But in the case of the elder that came to me, who was told to destroy notes, one of his biggest concerns was that because they didn't even handle this man judicially after his 3 children said he abused us, and this is a recent case, he said to me, well, this is disturbing because he's moved back into my state nearby and he lives right next door. He's obviously separated from his wife, but he lives right next door to a family that has a bunch of children. So you've got a known child molester that Watchtower knows, and they won't call the police. They waited until a parent called the police, but this guy's living right next door to family with children. They could have a cookout, come on over, kids, jump in the pool. Next thing you know, other non-witness children are abused by this person. They have no ability to control that.
And frankly, we know how this works, Mark, because you can have the best will in the world with this. You can be, let's say, you're really on the ball as a body of elders, and there's a number of elders who have children themselves, and they're really disturbed that this individual is in the congregation, so they're following them into the bathroom, as you just mentioned. You're really going to keep this up for years, for decades. You're going to follow them into the. I think we know that the level of attention a pedophile is going to get is going to noticeably diminish the more water there is under the bridge. And if you are again a determined pedophile, you'll know to bide your time. and wait until the guard slips, as it inevitably will when you place this kind of responsibility on humans. And that's the problem. And it gets kind of further, it gets more disturbing in a way in the next part of the paragraph, because it again exposes how little thought Watchtower has given to this. It says the service department will direct the elders to inform family heads of minors within the congregation of the need to monitor their children's interaction with the individual. The elders would take this step only if directed to do so by the service department. Well, first of all, and Mark, I think this was a change that was introduced, if memory serves, in the October 1st, 2012 letter, because I remember writing about it at the time. They made this concession and said, okay, well, maybe it is reasonable in some cases to notify family heads that there is a known predator in the congregation, but this isn't something where the elders get to take the initiative. This is something that the service department has to give them permission to do. So immediately we're not talking about in every instance this happening. We're only talking about if the service department deems it appropriate. And even then, Mark, Watchtower seems to think that they're keeping a lid on the issue if they're telling the family heads, here's a scenario. What if you're an elderly couple whose children have their own family visiting in another congregation and they decide to visit you for the weekend? You're not technically a family head because your children are grown up and they're in another congregation and they decide to visit. How are you supposed to know?
There's too many loopholes. Yeah, there's too many loopholes, Lloyd. It's look at, and I might just beat this drum once again by saying that I think the service and legal department are trying to protect themselves from lawsuits, which is why they are making the determination of whether or not elders would speak to a family member, because of several reasons. Number one, first and foremost, they're breaking privilege again. So not only do you have all of these service elders and local elders and other congregations that find out about this guy or this woman, whoever the abuser was, but then if you notify, let's say you might have 15 or 20 families that have young children in the congregation. It's not that uncommon these days to have lots of young kids. And you would have to inform all of them, and you'd have to keep track of when they leave and when new ones come in, as you pointed out. And then you'd have to keep track of when someone comes visiting that has children, and that happens all the time. Somebody comes visiting, they have kids. Hey, let's go out and field service after the meeting on Sunday, and let's invite brother child abuser to come along with us, because maybe they don't know any better. And then so you've got a dangerous situation, and then you've got people that are by virtue of telling them that this person, they don't tell him much, but they tell him he's got a problem with touching children, so they've broken privilege once again.
The next paragraph has to do with the issue of what do we do about privileges for child molesters. Now, I don't know whether you remember, but it was also one of the most shocking things in the October 1st, 2012 Elders letter was where it said words to the effect of, it cannot be said in all instances that one who has abused a child cannot serve, I think, as an elder. It said something along those lines, because I remember quoting from it at the time. And since then, they backed down a bit on that, but still not completely back down. So the wording here is, one who has engaged in child sexual abuse does not qualify to receive any privileges in the congregation, not full stop, but for many years, if ever. For me, that just slightly leaves the door ajar a little bit too much. I think that they could have done with a full stop after congregation.
And they won't do that, Lloyd, because it's a religion of forgiveness, where anyone can have their sins forgiven and come back and work themselves back into a position of authority. We've seen that time and time and time again. That is part of the draw of the religion. And I know it sounds like, using that term pedophile paradise, seems extreme, but the reality is when you evaluate the facts, it is one of the easier, most easy congregations or religions rather to have access to children and be able to commit these crimes with little protection for the congregation at Fall Paradise.
Apparently it's all about many years, and I said just a few moments ago, it's all very well having restrictions in place and following them into the bathroom, but you're going to keep that up year after year, decade after decade, and already we're seeing in this paragraph that many years will change things, because here it says, if the body of elders believe that one who has engaged in child sex abuse decades ago may now qualify for minor privileges such as carrying or using microphones, operating sound and video equipment, serving as an attendant, or assisting with accounts, literature, or territories, in other words, positions of trust, you could argue, they should assign 2 elders to call the service department. The assigned elders should call the service department before any congregation privileges are extended. And here's the thing, Mark. Even if there's like a culture, I mean, you could argue as an apologist, they're just saying this because from a theological standpoint, they need to extend forgiveness. But probably what's going to happen is, in reality, no privileges are ever going to be extended. But even if you take that assumption, and I don't accept that because it's not being written down. If it's not written down, then you can't really say it. But even if that's the case, what about pedophiles who were appointed as elders before the October 1st, 2012 letter and immediately after it, until the policy got tightened up? There doesn't seem to be any moratorium in place for those who managed to make it to the position of elder, even though they were known as a pedophile before 2012 and shortly thereafter.
Well, it's something that we're not going to go into detail about it now, but when we were in Australia, we interviewed some rather important people who revealed to us that in their investigation of Jehovah's Witnesses in Australia, that there were a number of high-ranking officials in the Watchtower organization whom they identified when they did their investigation. And I'm not naming any names or anything of that sort, but just the fact that they were aware that it was not just ministerial and servants and elders, but it was some higher-ranking individuals who had been guilty of child sexual abuse, who had still maintained and even later received even higher levels of authority and responsibility in the Jehovah's Witness organization. And that's something we're going to talk about in the future when we break some news. But it's, look, it's the matter of forgiveness, that a person, that, they don't fully understand that you can't cure child abuse or pedophilia.
They think it's something that you can just be sorry for. Yeah.
Right. And we can't, and I'm not here to decide. Pedophilia is something that's sort of a medical diagnosis, and we're not medical professionals. We're not going to diagnose it. I'm just using the word because it is a real thing, and it's not a curable disease, whatever you want to call it. It's not a curable illness. It's something that medical professionals and law enforcement has to deal with. So, Watchtower doesn't seem to understand that.
We were talking earlier, we need to just quickly move on to the next small section. It's just a single paragraph on filing. I alluded earlier to the fact that there's evidence actually in the Shepherd book concerning the child sex abuse database. If you know where to find it, this is where you find it. So, the question might be asked, how are elders supposed to deal with the information that they gather when they're carrying out all of these tasks, when they are investigating child sex abusers and so forth? Information concerning individuals associated with the congregation and accused of child sexual abuse, established or not, including letters of introduction, should be placed in an envelope labeled with the individual's name and marked "Do Not Destroy." This envelope should be kept in the congregation's confidential file. This would include notification of disfellowshipping or disassociation S77 forms on individuals who have committed child sexual abuse, even if later reinstated. If you understand the language and you can untangle it, what this is saying is essentially that there are two databases, if you think about it, because it's saying keep a database at the Kingdom Hall in the congregation's confidential file, and also make sure that you've got your S77 notification of disfellowshipping form filled out, which of course, if you flick onto other parts of the book, we know goes to Watchtower. So the evidence that they're gathering this information and storing it both at the Kingdom Hall and forwarding it onto Watchtower is actually right here in the book, if you know where to look.
So one thing I can share with everyone, and I think a few people have seen this before, is what the elders actually have to physically fill out, aside from their conversations they have with the legal and service department, is that when they have a child abuse case and they're required to begin filling out information and details, they fill out what's called a client intake or CSA questionnaire. So I'll just kind of hold that up to the camera right there. And this is a fairly recent...
I'll come to your rescue. I'm going to make you full screen.
Yeah. Okay. There we go. So this is called a client intake. Let me back it up a little bit so we're slightly in focus there. So client intake CSA questionnaire. Now this is just page 1. And it's a multi-page form with extensive information, and obviously all of this information gets entered into Watchtower's database. But the very first thing that it says is attorney-client privilege and confidentiality notice. So that's the first big box at the very top. The information requested below will enable Watchtower Legal Department to provide legal advice to the congregation and others who share a common interest with the congregation. The information will also enable the legal department to jointly defend the congregation, Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of New York, and or Christian Congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses should litigation arise. To preserve attorney-client confidentiality, this form must not be shared with anyone except the legal department. If questions arise, please call the legal department at, and then it has the legal department phone number. And then it goes on to explain the whole procedure. And I mean, it's just an extensive procedure of who they need to speak to. And like I say, this particular one is a very recent form. So I'm not showing the public something that's old. And I think I posted a link to this in one of my recent JW survey articles. If necessary, I can comment in the comment section and provide a link to it.
I also mentioned earlier, Mark, about the fact that it actually says in the Elders Manual that the S77 is to be shared with Watchtower. And just to be clear on that, it's actually in chapter 16.31. It says the Judicial Committee should promptly inform the Service Department of the disfellowshipping using the notification of disfellowshipping or disassociation form. So the whole purpose of the S77 is for the information to get forwarded on to Watchtower. And again, you have there in that filing paragraph proof that not only are they keeping a confidential file at the Kingdom Hall, but they're also keeping this S77 form that gets forwarded onto Watchtower. So it's right there in black and white if you know where to look.
Yeah.
Shall we?
A lot of information.
Before we tackle the final 3 sections, how do you feel about having a little bit of a break and letting some of our viewers pick up the slack?
Please.
Here's a nice line. Places to visit in North Yorkshire says the 8 governing body members should be arrested and given life sentences for destroying so many lives owing to their unscrupulous policies. I definitely agree that this is the sort of thing that should carry a criminal penalty, the covering up of child sex abuse. Let's just have a look. 720 Red Dog says filing is important until the police come, then make sure to burn everything. That's one kind of question that did occur to me, Mark, is on the one hand they're saying keep the information in the confidential file marked do not destroy, but we also have anecdotal evidence of elders destroying evidence once it's in this confidential file. So what are your thoughts on that?
And not just evidence that they have destroyed, but they are being told to destroy. And I think that's an important distinction. So that's a case where the elders aren't doing this of their own initiative. And I've given an example very recently where a coordinator of the body of elders who was dealing with an abuse case very recently, months ago, was told to destroy notes, specifically the notes that he was told not to contact law enforcement and report the abuse that occurred in his state. And I'm being careful not to mention any of the details. And that's not just anecdotal evidence. We have lots of cases. I think our good friend Debbie McDaniel wrote a book in which there was obstruction of justice by the elders removing documents from the Kingdom Hall before the police were able to get their hands on them. And look, this is sanctioned by the organization. This came up at trial many times, like at the Fessler trial. If you go back to the July 1st, 1989 Body of Elders letter, they have an entire, this is a 6-page letter that the Watchtower organization did not want to give up and did not want anyone to find out about, because it deals with crimes, criminal investigation, child abuse, search warrants, and subpoenas. And it goes into all sorts of information. It says things like, at any time an elder is confronted with a search warrant, the elder should first ask to read the warrant. This is long. I'm not going to read all of this, but it says to contact the legal department. It goes into detail about how they are to do everything possible to protect their records and to not cooperate with law enforcement, short of having, the subpoena show up at the door, and have the police threaten to break the door down before they would give up this information. So they absolutely don't, because look, I've said this before, it all goes back to their interpretation of several scriptures, not just the 2-witness rule, but it goes back to 1 Corinthians chapter 6, where the elders or the society, the Watchtower organization, reads those scriptures, and that says that, do you not know that, you are superior to the superior authorities? In other words, do you not know that you will judge angels? And so how is it that you're letting these small matters be dictated in court, or you're taking each other to court as brothers? So it's very clear that they don't want any of their business in a court, in a civil court, which is why or a criminal court either. They don't want these elders to cooperate with law enforcement in a criminal or a civil matter. They run to the First Amendment all the time and say, this is our First Amendment guarantee of freedom of religion, and that we can practice however we wish, because that is our religious right. However, the courts don't agree.
Ray of Light says they protect the congregation from the cigarette smoker. They protect the pedophile from the congregation's outrage. Let's see here. Eyes on the prize. Oh, sorry. It was actually Alev's comment that I wanted to read. Anyone accused of child abuse needs to be reported to the police. And Troll Princess says, I feel like all of the rules in this chapter just exist to give elders the feeling that they're protecting children. I agree with you there, Troll Princess. It feels as though even the elders, to some degree, are kept in the dark. You have different levels of deception based on how high up in the organization you are. This is a a different level to what you find in the May 2019 Watchtower, but it's still withholding information and reframing information in a certain way. Another commenter who is familiar to Mark says it is too subjective along with the loopholes. Thank you so much for joining us, Kimmy. Okay, so Alev says parents are also responsible for their children and should warn children about predators. I think, unfortunately, Alev, that's the kind of go-to answer that Watchtower gives when they're trying to defend themselves. They push all of the blame onto the parents while ignoring the fact that they are creating an environment where children can be preyed on through these policies.
And of course, that's the correct answer. You know, of course, children are responsible for their parents. That's not the point. The point is that clergy are mandated reporters, and that's for the protection of the public and for the congregation. So, you know, it's irrelevant that parents are responsible for their children. They'll always be responsible for their children. Some of the parents are themselves the abusers. So you got to take that into consideration, or maybe it's a step parent. So it's just an irrelevant comment to say, throw the burden on the parents. You've got to put the blame where it lands. And you mentioned the governing body earlier. And that was one of the things that, you know, it was important for me to help prove that Jackson was tied to the policy making of the organization during the 2015 Australian Royal Commission, because he was there lying and his attorneys were lying, claiming that he had no connection to the policy making regarding child abuse or anything else. He was just he was a man involved in translation services. But it was proved that the governing body do indeed form and enforce the policy of the organization. In fact, I'm going to share something, Lloyd, that was donated to JW Survey. I've never shown this before. Branch organization manual. You'll be seeing this very soon, Lloyd.
Yeah, I know. So, I'm looking forward to it.
This 1977. So this is a very, very early copy. And this branch organization, which, by the way, this copy came directly from someone who was at headquarters in Bethel, and I felt that it was important to show it because, look, this is a very thick manual that no one, not even the elders, know about. Look, it's as thick as the elders' manual, right? But no one knows about this. Not even the elders themselves know about it. So how can they comment on stuff that they don't even know about? But this directs how to run a branch office, how policies are made, and it directly connects the governing body to all of the policies of the organization. And this is one of the strongest reasons why they ended up issuing a subpoena to Jeffrey Jackson for the Royal Commission, because of what is contained in this book, which has been updated multiple times, by the way.
Although it must be said, it's kind of encouraging. I don't want to jump to conclusions too much, but Alev, assuming that you are a Jehovah's Witness, assuming that, it's encouraging that you're watching the channel, and well done for doing that. And Tamara Heseltine says, so much simpler to turn this over to the law. Absolutely agree with you there, Tamara. So let's press on to the next section, which is moving to another congregation. This also kind of highlights the level of control and the level of involvement that the service department has, because rather than allowing elders to notify another congregation that there's an abuser incoming, everything has to go through the service department. So here it says, the Congregation Service Committee should not send any information to the new congregation until after receiving legal advice from the legal department and direction from the service department. So even in something as straightforward as saying, hey guys, you know, you've got a pedophile on his way or on her way to your congregation. No, everything has to go through the legal department and the service department. You also have in paragraph 27, when the elders are informed that an individual who has been accused of child sexual abuse, established or not, has moved into the congregation, Well, you'd think the police should be notified or at least consulted. Instead, two elders should immediately call the legal department. And Mark, I'm interested in your thoughts here. If the individual is disfellowshipped and living within the congregation's territory, the elders should list that address on the appropriate congregation territory card as a do not call. Who knew that the do not call provision could be enlisted for protecting children from child abusers?
So, yeah, this is a great point. In fact, that was one of the assignments that I had in my congregation, was producing the congregation's territories and also maintaining any of the information that is attached to a territory. For example, the do not call list. And I can tell you that while I did a great job putting these territories together, there was almost no attention to the do not call list. It was haphazard, random. We have known child abusers or convicted child abusers living in our congregation's territories. And my understanding is that what they're supposed to do here is to put those addresses on a list so that you don't have, a mother and her two kids, show up at the house of a known pedophile. Because think about it, you're in a public place, knocking on the doors of private homes, and you do not know what is on the other side of that door. And I think we had a case in Colorado a few years ago where, one of the people who watches reads JW Survey contacted us and said, he videotaped a JW who was a known child molester in field service in, outside of Colorado Springs, Colorado, videotaped this man and confronted him in the field ministry as he was going from door to door or house to house in the car group filled with witnesses. So, I can tell you from my personal experience that it is absolutely haphazard. They occasionally will assign this responsibility to, someone who's not that qualified to do this do not call list. The elders are too busy to maintain it. They're doing their elders meetings and everything else. It is just very poorly maintained, and you could very easily put yourself in a position where a known child abuser is on the other side of the door. In that case, and I think what you're trying to bring out is a disfellowshipped individual living in the congregation's territory. So it's, that's a problem, but it's even bigger than that. It's not just the disfellowshipped person. It's any child molester. They don't protect.
And the same sort of thinking that the do not call list can be used to protect children is transferred into the next section, which is again just a short paragraph. Notification by secular authorities. From time to time, secular authorities may inform the others that a sex offender is living in the area. The notice may provide the address of the individual and may state the nature of his criminal activity. In such a case, the elders should list that address on the appropriate congregation territory as a do not call. I guess here's my main problem with this, other than the fact that it just seems so, it feels lazy to me that that's their way of dealing with the issue. Stick them on the do not call list. But there's a practical concern here as well, Mark, which is that I can still vividly remember going house to house in the preaching work. And at the beginning of the preach, let's say it's a morning meeting, and they hand out the do not call. They say, you're working Jones Street. Here's your do not calls. And you'll write them down. And inevitably, you'll get into a conversation. You'll be engrossed in conversation. And you'll get into the rhythm of going from one door to the next door to the next door to the next door. And you will call on the do not call. It just happens all the time. It is not just having the list doesn't mean that witnesses, and especially when witnesses don't know that the list is also being used to protect the congregation from pedophiles because they don't have access to this information. It's one thing thinking, the worst case scenario is that we're going to get an angry person. They don't know that actually the worst case scenario is that while they're calling with little Jimmy, a monster answers the door. They don't know that because they don't have access to this information.
It is absolutely true, and it's not just anecdotal, Lloyd. It's very true. I've had it happen to me many times. You know, we're working a territory, either driving or door to door, and you know, you go and work this street, and you've done all the houses, and then you get back to the car, and the person who holds the territory, which may not be you, that person holding the territory says, "Oh, I forgot to tell you, house 937. That's a do not call." Oh, you know, and look. I would go even further with this to say that this situation involves a far greater issue than even just child abuse and pedophilia and the danger of that, but it's the danger that the organization puts every witness in when they send them into the door-to-door ministry to knock on random strangers' doors. It has always been, since I was a child. I remember, you know, my mother one day came home from field service traumatized because she was at a door with another sister, and this man came to the door and, you know, took off all of his clothes, you know, and that was a sexual assault. And, you know, people joke about that now, like, oh, that's the way to scare Jehovah's Witnesses away. But look, that's pretty serious. And it does happen. It happened to my mother, and she was traumatized from that. And you don't know what's on the other side of that door. You know, that person, besides that, let's take child abuse out of the equation. You could have a convicted murderer that is out of prison now behind that door. So there is an inherent danger in putting children, and I've seen many children that are minors go, because they're both publishers and baptized. The parents say, okay, well, we'll keep an eye on you. You can go and do these houses. But, you know, not all parents allow their children to do this, but I've seen children working by themselves. I wouldn't let that happen myself. But, you know, look, we're all in danger of, you go to a strange person's house, and we've all worked thousands and thousands of doors in these territories, and you don't know what's on the other side. People that had shotguns pulled on them. I know we're talking about child abuse, but this is a more broad ranging issue of, you know, putting anyone in danger by going, you know, in that ministry.
Let's just take the final section, and then we'll take some comments. So we're on to sexual misconduct involving only minors, and there wasn't too much of concern here, Mark, unless I've missed something. There was something I did want to point out in the opening words. Here it says, minors who engage in sexual misconduct with one another are not generally considered by the congregation as having engaged in child sexual abuse. It still seems to be assuming that minors can consent to sex. And one thing that you do hear about is when a victim creates victims themselves. So they're a child sex abuse victim. Let's say they're 16, 17 years old, and then they go on to molest, let's say, an infant because of they've had this kind of behavior normalized. How would this sort of dismissive language translate to that kind of situation?
Boy, Lloyd, you know, we'd be here all night if I told you how many cases in my own congregation alone involved young people who were sexually abused and then transferred that abuse to other young people. It happened over and over and over again. It was all handled internally. And I'll give you just one example, because there's way more than I could ever count. And that's one reason I do this work, because I have firsthand knowledge of it. I've seen it growing up. It just boggles my mind. So I know that these people who are telling this story from around the world are telling the truth when it happens. But just in one case, you know, a young woman had come to my wife and I. She's a very good friend of ours, and I was extremely close with her husband, you know, in our congregation. And she was disfellowshipped, and we didn't know why. We didn't know, you know, if she had a boyfriend, if, you know, whatever the case. We were concerned that something had happened to her. And, you know, I don't want to go into too much detail, but as it turns out, when this other case happened, where I mentioned that another young woman had come to me about being abused by a different JW woman. So that particular case, that triggered me to have a 3-hour interview with a police corporal. I later contacted the police corporal about this other case of this young woman who was just disfellowshipped, who was 17 at the time. And as it turns out, and I'm trying to keep this as simple as possible, but as it turns out, the police had interviewed this other young 17-year-old girl because, as she later revealed to us, because she got out of her home, got out of the religion, everything, she had been, she was disfellowshipped. So her parents cut her off, took away her phone, her job, took away all communication with the outside world. She was basically being held captive. And she's, a wonderful woman, but she then confided in us that she had been sexually molested by a fourth individual in our congregation, and that's why the police ended up interviewing her. The same corporal that I had interviewed with ended up interviewing her, and the whole thing came out. In fact, the police corporal said to me, he said, "Mark, I've interviewed a lot of people, and I don't want to go into too much detail, but every case you've told me about and every case I've interviewed have all been female abusers. And is there a reason for that?" And I said, no, I said, it's, that's just, there's probably an equal number of male and female abusers in the organization. It doesn't discriminate. This crime doesn't discriminate. But the point was that this young woman, the elders knew for years what this other young sister in the congregation, they were both young baptized females, and the one abused our friend, and no one ever told the police. So it wasn't until this police corporal found out about this that they finally interviewed all of the people involved, and they took it very seriously, which the elders never did. They swept the whole thing under the rug. So I wish I could tell you more. Actually, I don't wish I could tell you more, but
no. It's nice to say that. I mean, it's just been written by amateurs, hasn't it? This chapter, and it leaves so much room for humans to inflict misery on other humans, and it's all being facilitated by this backward, hierarchical, power obsessed, sex obsessed organization.
I almost feel like the organization is normalizing the behavior. I almost feel like they expect it, and there's so much of this. It's because Jehovah's Witnesses are an extremely insular organization. So, it's this weird. There's so much. All the young people only associate with each other, and within their peer groups. And I've seen so much of this sexual contact and abuse happening within these closed groups, because not only are the kids sexually repressed, but they start experimenting with each other, and it gets swept under the rug by the elders. It's not taken very seriously, and it's almost like the organization kind of expects this behavior and says, "Look, we're just going to deal with it in a scriptural way," and that ends up leading to more and more. As you pointed out earlier, it's an abused victim can go on to sexually molest a child. It sadly happens all the time.
Quite a few people picking up on what we were saying earlier about the dangers involved in preaching and showing up on people's doorsteps unannounced. Drella Sutseniza says, "I've watched too much Unsolved Mysteries and always felt door to door was an at your own risk service, which I wasn't willing to take. I stopped going." Alev, who I think we heard from earlier, said, what Mark said about door-to-door dangers goes to show the importance of door-to-door work should be viewed with less importance. What should be more important for members is their overall conduct. Well, I would suggest it's not just the conduct of the members, it's the conduct of the organization. And how can you think too much about members bringing Jehovah's name into reproach when you have these dreadful policies that are far worse in many cases than what the members are getting up to. Drella, who I should comment from earlier, she also says, "I always taught my kids about stranger danger and had to stop going door to door because I had to set the example by not knocking on strangers' doors. No lie. I wouldn't suggest you are lying there, Drella. And Tamara Hesseltine says, and they go into home if interest is shown. Well, that's the point. These child molesters who were on the do not call list, they maybe don't even know that they're on the do not call list, and they certainly don't want to be necessarily on the do not call list. So whereas a genuine do not call might shout and might act in a very uninviting way if witness is called by mistake, you couldn't expect that sort of behavior from a child molester who's actually probably welcoming some visitors, and relishes the thought of inviting people in.
Well, that's the problem. Child molesters are delusional, and they're mentally sick, and they don't think twice about their actions. This Arkansas case proved that to me when I saw this man with no remorse, thinking he didn't do anything wrong, that he never touched or sexually touched these children, and that there was nothing wrong. The prosecutor went after him, verbally just destroyed him when the elder took the stand and said, didn't you ever think once that your conduct, after having what happened in 1988 in Bethel with, this 20-year-old boy, didn't you once think that your conduct would be in question when you put yourself around all of these young children? Didn't you once? And, he said, no, I'm not, I'm not gay. I'm not, again, the trying to connect being gay with being a pedophile. He denied all of that. We're dealing with a serious mental illness, sickness, and a crime here. And the regular rule book just doesn't apply. And these elders can't handle that.
Troll Princess says, I've gone to houses on the do not call list several times. It's easy to lose track of which house you're at, especially with kids distracting you. That's a good point, actually. You're probably more liable. You're more at risk of forgetting the do not call list if you do have kids with you. And Berserker makes a very good point. The do not call list doesn't protect wider society. It's all very well you knowing that this individual lives there and is a danger to children. What about the community in general? These rules are all geared towards supposedly protecting Jehovah's Witnesses, which we know they don't. They're not drawn up with the welfare of other people in mind. So, Mark, we have come to the end of chapter 14, but I was kind of hoping, I don't know how you are for time, on just quickly looking at some of the other chapters. Very quickly. How's the cat situation?
Look, it's an important subject. So look, my cat's still sleeping, and Kimmy's on her way home, so we've got some time. Let's this is totally ad lib. This is ad lib here, so don't hold me to any standard of research.
In for a penny, in for a pound. We've made it past the 3-hour mark. We may as well see this thing through to the bitter end. I did want to share. Let's see here. I did want to share some material.
You're going to get some angry comments. Why are your videos so long, Lloyd? And as you like to put, they're as long as they need to be.
Exactly. That's exactly the point.
We're having a good conversation.
Indeed. You have here some material in chapter 12, which I was going through with Cliff, but there is here this paragraph 28. One who reports an accusation to the police, the court, the elders, or others who have authority to look into matters and render a judgment would not be viewed by the congregation as guilty of committing slander. This is true even if the accusation is not proved. This is clearly a welcome reform, but it is nevertheless a reform. There was a similar provision included in the KS10, the 2010 Shepherd book, but there was no similar provision in the Pay Attention book, which I think is why we hear so many horrific anecdotes of witnesses, of victims being judicially treated because they've reported.
Again, it's deceptive wording, Lloyd. It's just the fact that this says one who reports an accusation to the police, etc. One, O-N-E. It doesn't say elders, right? So it's not telling elders is that elders are not permitted to directly contact the authorities without going through Watchtower's headquarters, particularly with child abuse. So, it's very broad, deceptive, and loose language. There's probably a better word to describe it, but it's obfuscating.
Yeah.
To say one who reports an accusation to the police would not be viewed as guilty of committing slander. I mean, look,
you think it could be tighter?
as everything else in this book could be summed up with one sentence.
41 in chapter 12. I think I actually touched on this with Cliff. They have inserted this sentence that doesn't appear in the KS-10. A victim of rape or of child sexual abuse is never required to confront the abused. But I did want to compare that with some provisions, and I think I went through this with Cliff, but I'm interested to know your thoughts on this. When you go to, and I think rather than show it on the screen, I'm just going to read to you from my copy of the book. So when you go to chapter 16.18, there's the provision for witnesses, and when we use the word witnesses, we mean witnesses to the wrongdoing. So in other words, in this context, child sex abuse victims, if witnesses, this is talking as well about people who've been reproved by a judicial committee, if witnesses testify during the hearing, they may be invited to hear the scriptural reproof. In this way, the wrongdoer is reproved before all onlookers, and there is no clear statement there that this wouldn't be expected of child sex abuse victims.
Well, I going back to 41, it's tough, Lloyd, because where it says here a victim of rape or child sexual abuse is never required to confront the abused, that is just false. That's, look, we've got it in writing.
Yeah.
But it's false. I mean, I gave you an example of this Roderick Watkins, one of his, victims that I spoke to was absolutely required to confront. Well, let me just backtrack and say that, look, he was a child abuse victim, but he was raped by this man, and the elders directly confronted the victim because they could not, his wife and sister were trying to protect him, but they could not or would not do anything judicially about Roderick Watkins without directly speaking to the victim, who is now an adult. So, but this says here, it says a victim of rape or child sexual abuse is never required to confront the abuse. So this doesn't say anything about the age. Correct me if I'm wrong. It doesn't say anything about the age of the victim, either at the time of the crime or at the time of the report. So what I can tell you is that this is the same person who, and this is recently, that was confronted by the elders who wanted to give him a whole list of questions, including, were you naked when you were sexually assaulted or raped? So it's absolutely false. They pick and choose. I guess
what you're saying is it's all very well writing this, and I would, for the sake of fairness, argue that at least they've put it in there.
Yes.
But what you're saying is it's one thing to put it in there; it's another thing entirely to put it into practice. And we have anecdotal evidence that it's not being put into practice. And quite frankly, when every other paragraph is saying consult the service department, consult the legal department, it kind of becomes irrelevant what the actual chapter is saying, because elders will know that irrespective of what they've got in front of them in black and white, what takes priority is what they're told over the phone.
There's also the issue of being informed of this. So, you got to remember, this is a thick book of materials, and are the elders informing? Because the average victim doesn't know there's an elder's manual. They have no idea, right? So they don't know all this stuff is in writing. They don't know the elders are following. They're making all these phone calls to the service department, the legal department. They don't know any of this. They know none of this. So when it says here, a victim of rape or child sexual abuse is never required to confront the accused, they're not being told that by the elders. The elders are reading that and interpreting that on their own, but they're not telling the victim up front, hey, by the way, you know, we don't have to talk to you about you don't have to talk to us about this at all. And then that victim could say, okay, then I don't want to talk to you about it. You know, that's their choice. But they're not, they don't know, Lloyd. They're not informed.
Let's also just take a look at this. I thought you might find this interesting, Mark, also on the issue of clergy penitent privilege. While extensive details of a case do not need to be conveyed to the entire body of elders, enough information should be presented for them to determine whether a disfellowshipping offence is actually being committed. So the entire body of elders gets to have at least the bare bones of a situation, presumably including the accusation and the names of the individuals, and yet this is supposed to be clergy penitent privilege.
And they have to, according to their own rules, because, for example, let's say you have a child abuser who is a Watchtower declares them a known child abuser from New York, and then the elders are instructed that they may inform family heads. So the point is that they can't just have 1, 2, or 3 elders who know about this child abuser. If one knows, they all have to know, because congregation members are now being informed that there's a child abuser in their midst, and you can't have an elder in the dark where another publisher comes to him and says, you know, Brother Smith, the coordinator of the body of elders, told me that this guy is a child molester and to watch out for my children. Is that true? Right? So you can't have any of the elders in the dark. They all have to be informed. And then if a ministerial servant is appointed as an elder, then he becomes aware of it. So you constantly have appointments. And then you have deletions. So even those who were deleted still know about what happened. And you have this wider and wider swath of individuals, group of individuals who know.
I like you using the word swath, by the way. That's does my heart glad. And I want to show you chapter 16.17. Let's have a look here. So this is dealing with note-taking. Anything submitted in writing to the committee by the alleged wrongdoer or by witnesses should be kept in strict confidence. If it is necessary to continue the matter later, the members of the committee should turn over to the chairman any personal notes they have taken, which may be, in the case of child abuse, criminal evidence. The chairman will keep these notes in a secure place to prevent breaches of confidentiality. So,
yeah, that's interesting. I mean, look, they're talking about confidentiality within their own sphere of influence, within their own domain. And yet, how many of these elders end up knowing about these situations, plus the circuit overseer, plus the legal department, plus depends on what the case is. Obviously, the child abuse cases go straight to New York. And to be fair, other religions, a few other religions that are controlling like this, the Mormon Church has a very similar arrangement where they have a call-in hotline, which basically connects their bishops to their own legal department. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this because it's something I will report on in the future and we don't have time. But the Watchtower organization has consulted with the Mormon churches, some of their legal representatives, with regards to these ongoing civil lawsuits against both religions. So you've got a collusion of information here between the Mormons and the Jehovah's Witnesses. And, we have documentation of that.
The viewers your scoop about the Mormon Church, Mark. We can save that for our Watchtower in Focus.
Yeah.
It's a big story, that. It's a big story.
Yeah.
which we will be discussing in more detail. I just finally want to show you in chapter 16, just to tie off what we were saying about reproof. Let's see here. It's talking about how the wording of the reproof is name of person has been reproved. That's all that really is said to the congregation. What else have I put in my notes? Oh yeah, also in 20.1, where is that? It repeats this myth that the reproof will safeguard the congregation. I can't see exactly where it says that actually now, come to think of it. Here we are. Announcing the reproof of a repentant wrongdoer will serve as a protection for the congregation. So just repeating that idea that everything's okay because we've announced that such and such a body's been reproved. So
yeah, and it won't, because in the case of child abuse, unless you are a parent who happens to be informed with Watchtower's consent or a service department consent, you're not going to know that an individual is a child sexual abuser. So it's pointless. And I want to say something in all fairness to the Watchtower organization and the religion. In all fairness, we have to ask ourselves, this is a serious problem, is child abuse. What do we expect to happen? Do we expect a known child abuser who has been identified as such, that's abused members of the congregation? Do we expect the organization to get up and make an announcement and say, Joe Smith is a known child abuser and you should keep your children away from him? Do we expect that to happen? Well, no, I don't think we're asking that to happen. That's not really the issue. It's a problem of religion and insular society and how close-knit everyone is and the problems that it creates when you're in such a closed environment. So what do? Well, what we're really saying is cooperate with law enforcement, treat it as a crime, go to the authorities, let the professionals handle it, let the therapist handle it. The problem is that Watchtower believes that this interferes with their religious rights and their First Amendment rights. And that's why this is all coming to a head. And that's why it came to a head in JW versus Watchtower that went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court knocked it down. And it was basically the first, well, they wouldn't take the case. So whether you can call it a loss or not, that's for the lawyers to decide. But I would call it a loss because the Supreme Court would not take that case. And I don't know, Lloyd, maybe it's a subject for another episode, but what are we saying? I know it's difficult when you have someone go into a religious group and commit a crime like child abuse, sin and crime against a child. And what are we expecting them to do besides
I think we said what we were expecting at the very beginning, which is condense the entire chapter to child sex abuse is a crime, full stop, and move on to the next chapter. If you take that approach
the answer
and that mentality, it will solve a lot of problems. Phil Marley says, I'm looking forward to the governing body being sued by a Zolkin law firm. Bring it on. Well, it's already happening, in fact.
And not only that, they have revised their the amended complaint and have included the names of the governing body members in that. The first complaint named the governing body. The subsequent complaint in, I think, 2 of Zolkin's cases have actually named the men on the governing body. I don't have the documents in front of me, but we'll supply them.
Okay. And 720 Red Dog said, this book is very disturbing, but the whole JW belief system is deeply troubling. David Morgan says, anyone else? Can't wait to see the governing body in jail. And there was, I think, another one. 720 Red Dog also said, I liked this comment. I mean, how does anyone not feel like they have gone down the rabbit hole with this book? I definitely feel that way. I don't know about you, Mark, but in preparing for this and the previous live stream, it really eats away at your soul to deal with this material, because I think I've said it before, but examining this book it's like staring into the eyes of a cult and seeing how much control they want and how much damage they're doing.
It really is. It's a completely unnecessary batch of information that has to do with how to run a deeply controlling religion that's affected the lives of not just 8 million people, but millions and millions before who aren't with us now, and maybe thousands who have died because of Watchtower's blood policy, and many who died at very young ages who would have left the religion, because a certain percentage of young people are going to leave the religion anyway. And, you know, they've died without ever having had a chance to mentally mature and get to the age where they can make a decision. You know, it took me decades to wake up and leave. And it was sort of like through poking the hole in that bubble where I just started peering through and realizing that I'm part of a deeply controlling organization. And I remember that, you know, day that I went upstairs and told my wife that, you know, I was done and that my brain was being turned to mashed potatoes. It was the best way I could describe it. And it was certainly the best decision I've ever made in my life to get out. And look, I know that Watchtower's watching this. I know that, you know, people in the service department monitor these things. I want to reach out to, you know, right through this screen and ask, and well, first of all, thank everyone for watching. And someone might watch this 6 months from now, who knows? But I want to reach out and say that, you know, we're here to help you. We know what it's like being on the other side. You know, we were very faithful witnesses who served as servants, elders, pioneers, all of that. And we care very much about Jehovah's Witnesses and their families and their welfare. And you can reach out to us privately with full anonymity, and we're not going to expose you or say anything disruptive to your faith, whether you're, you know, a devout witness or whether you're thinking about leaving the religion, you know. And also, if you're part of the legal department of Watchtower and the service department, you can reach out to us anonymously, and we will treat that with a great deal of respect, because we've already had more elders than I can count, including circuit overseers, reach out to us because they know that we're genuine and sincere and that we want to help, and that, look, we're going through this information in this book that has affected the lives of millions of people, and we want to do something about it.
Indeed. Well, listen, I think we have a winner in terms of my longest ever video on this channel. So thank you for staying the course and running through this epic video with me. Again, it's hard to understate just how much material we've had to wade through in terms of how impactful this is. So I think that if I am going to have a 3.5-hour video, it might as well be on this subject. So thank you so much, Mark, for setting aside this time.
You bet, Lloyd. It's an important subject, and you know, we're not wasting time here. It's something that has to be said, and we're just going to put it out there, and we're going to let everybody digest little bits of it if they want. Look at it 15 minutes at a time, whatever. And if it helps somebody, then we've done our job.
So viewers, I hope you have enjoyed part 2 of this series. Part 3 with Sherry D'Souza going through the remaining material in the Shepherd book will be on the channel soon. Look out for the information soon. But thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for your super chats. Thank you for your support of what we're doing. We really do appreciate it. Don't forget to, as usual, subscribe for more videos. But for now, thank you so much for watching. Take care. I just have